Good morning. Welcome back to Why Trust the Bible. We're glad that you're here again this morning. As you make your way in, and you are making your way in, thank you. Is there anyone who was hoping to buy Who is Jesus, but we were sold out? I've got one copy here for you. For the rest of you who were hoping to get a copy, we are going to order more of those, and we'll have those at church. So if you're around Castleview, just look for those at the book place, hopefully by a week from tomorrow, a week from Sunday. So we'll have more of those to sell at cost. Or if you're not, again, you can find those online. You can get them for, I think, $10 or $11 on Amazon. So look for those here at Castleview in the coming weeks. We are excited to continue what we started last night. For those of you who weren't here when I introduced Greg in the second session, Greg and I first met in Washington, D.C., and then in Louisville, Kentucky. Jess and I had joined Third Avenue Baptist Church. We had already known Greg. And when our pastor resigned, he was brought on to replace him as the senior pastor. So we were so excited about that within our first year there at Third Avenue. He and his wife, Mariah, have 3 children, Justin, Jack, and Juliet. Juliet is now 9, which is hard to believe because I picture her as a little toddler. But we are excited to have Greg here. He studied undergrad at Yale. He went to Southern Seminary where he got his MDiv, and now he's a PhD candidate in systematic theology at Southern Seminary. So, Greg, looking forward to session 3.
Thanks. 9:45. What time do you want to end? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Glad to have you all back here to study our trust in the Bible a little bit more. Last night, I told you I took you to kind of the end of the argument. Can you just raise your hand if you were here last night, at least for that first talk? Okay, that's basically everybody. Okay, so last night I took you to what I said was going to be the end of the argument, the sort of capstone of the whole thing, which is that if you believe Jesus rose from the dead, you therefore ought to believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And that's not circular reasoning, that's not a presupposition, that's not just a leap of faith sort of into the ether. What it is a considered opinion that's based on and a considered argument based on the nature of the resurrection, what it is and what it does in the life and ministry of Jesus, how it functions in his own sort of self-proclamation and self-revelation, and then understanding what Jesus' identity means for how we should think about the Old Testament first and then the New Testament. So that's where we wound up last night, and then spent the second session thinking a little bit more about what the Bible teaches about who Jesus is. Today, what I want to do, though, is not jump to the end of the argument, but start at the beginning of it, because you can't just start with the argument, or you can't just at least leave it there, that Jesus rose from the dead, and therefore we ought to believe that the Bible is the Word of God. Because you're making a huge leap from sort of nothing all the way over to the conclusion that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and you've got to fill that in some way, right? Now, how do you do that? How do you get to the conclusion, so to speak, that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore make your way on to believing that the Bible is the Word of God? How do you get over that gap? How do you get over the river from not believing that Jesus rose from the dead to in fact believing that he did? Well, part of that is actually determining that the Bible is in fact reliable as just historical documents, right? If you can establish a sort of chain of reliability that the Bible we're looking at is written by people who are historically reliable and that we actually know what they said, then you can have pretty good evidence. You can have what we call historical confidence in believing that Jesus in fact did resurrect from the dead. So that's what we're going to do today over the course of these couple of sessions. We're going to be talking about how to make a case really for the Bible's documents being historical, particular emphasis on the Gospels, because that's where the case for Jesus' resurrection is mostly made. Can we have any trust in the 4 Gospels as being historically reliable? And then can we make our way from sort of nothing all the way over to Jesus was resurrected from the dead? Now, let me start just by talking about one way that you really can't do this, or at least that the world is not going to buy if you're trying to press it on them. One of the ways that Christians will often sort of try to fill in the gap between nothing and the resurrection is to say, well, the reason I believe that that Jesus rose from the dead is because the Bible is the Word of God, and the Bible says that He rose from the dead, right? I'm sure you've heard that. You may have even made that argument before. I believe the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore it says that Jesus rose from the dead, and therefore I believe Jesus rose from the dead. And then the question comes, okay, well, why do you believe that the Bible is the Word of God? And if you use the argument that we used last night, well, what you would say is, well, I believe the Bible is the Word of God because Jesus resurrected from the dead. Well, why do you believe Jesus resurrected from the dead? Because the Bible is the Word of God. Why do you believe the Bible is the Word of God? Because Jesus resurrected from the dead. You see how that's a circular argument and you're sort of stuck in it? Well, so you can't really do that, right? Or you can't start at that kind of an argument. It just doesn't get you very far. It may be settling to your own soul, but any non-believer who's engaged with you in this conversation is going to go, yeah, I don't really buy that, right? Now, one thing we need to get straight right from the outset, especially if you're a thinker who's trying to figure out, how do I make this argument and how do these Christians do this kind of thing? One thing that we have to get straight from the start is that every single human being at some point or another winds up in a circular argument. We just do. That's the nature of our knowledge. It's the nature of epistemology. There's no real bedrock that we can get to where we can say, I absolutely know that this thing is true. Now, philosophers have tried that throughout history, right, to find some sort of bedrock that you can start on. So René Descartes, for instance, had this famous argument. You may have heard of it. What he said was cogito ergo sum, and so it's come to be known as the cogito. But what that is translated is I think, therefore I am. Right? And he thought that he could boil this whole thing down and say, if I know for a fact that I am thinking, and I can know for a fact that I'm thinking because I am in fact thinking, well then I can say that if I think, then therefore I exist. And René Descartes thought that once he had that little nugget of information, that he exists because he's thinking, he could build up the whole sort of edifice of human knowledge out of that one little piece of absolute, what he took to be absolute truth. Well, the problem is you can't build from that. You can be pretty certain, yes, it makes logical sense that if I think, therefore I am, a thinking thing exists in some form or another. But there's no way you can really get any further. There's this uncrossable gap between I am and what I am, right? You can't figure out exactly what you are. Are you embodied, or are you, just thinking that you're embodied? Are you, like we said last night, a brain in a vat? Have you ever seen like comic books, Mad Scientists, where you got a brain in a vat of solution with nodes put into it, and the computer is convincing this brain that it's actually on a beach, right? Well, the thing that philosophers have said is, how do we all know that we're not just a brain in a vat? How do we know that we're not the dream of some blue-eyed giant out in the ether, and we're just, how do we know? I mean, who was it? I think it was who's the famous cosmologist who has cystic fibrosis? Huh? No. He just died, I believe. Stephen Hawking. Yeah, I couldn't understand you. That's right. Stephen Hawking actually said that he thought it was more likely that we are actually all in a simulation from some other computer in somebody else's world than that we actually exist by the time he died. I mean, this is like the world's foremost cosmologist and physicist and all the rest, and he says it's actually more likely that we're a computer simulation than that we actually exist. And the point in philosophy is that ultimately it's just impossible to figure that out, right? And so what happens with human beings is that in order to sort of make our lives work, we end up making certain presuppositions that we don't have any real good reasons for, or at least ones that are like bedrock, inarguable presuppositions, and we just run with them, right? I mean, everybody, no matter what your source of kind of knowledge is, you're going to get to this circular thing down at the bottom, right? So let's say you take reason as your sort of ultimate authority. Like, I will only believe those things which are absolutely reasonable. And you start to press on that, like, well, why are you only going to believe things that are absolutely reasonable? Well, because it's reasonable to do that, right? Okay, there we are. See that circle? Or you take somebody who says, I will only believe those things that are traditional. Okay, well, why are you only going to believe those things that are traditional? Well, because that's what everybody has always done, right? or some combination. Well, it's reasonable to only believe what the majority of human beings have ever believed. So you see, at the bottom of it is this circularity that I think is one of God's ways of reminding us as human beings that we don't have it all figured out, right? It's a way of reminding us of our finitude and His infinity. So what do you do if that's the case, right? If you're trying to build up a foundation, if you're trying to even just live in the world, what do you have to do? Well, every single human being ends up having to do one of two things. Either you become like Nietzsche and Hume, and you just throw up your hands, or Bishop Berkeley back in the 19th century, and say, well, we just can't know anything, and you drop into a sort of, horrible hole of skepticism where you don't trust anybody or anything, and you just won't nail anything down. Or if you're like most human beings, you just make certain presuppositions about the world, right? And you run with them. So, for example, you simply presuppose, you just lock it into the sort of software of your head that your five senses are generally reliable, right? So if I see a pew there, I generally lock it into the software of my mind that if I'm seeing it, most of the time the pew is there. And so I can walk over, and if I'm walking, right, I don't distrust my eyes and try to walk through that pew. That's going to hurt, right? Most of the time I trust my eyes and I'll go around it, right? Same thing with your sense of smell and touch and all the rest. You generally say, my senses are reliable. The trouble is you don't have any way of proving that. Right? It may be that, again, all of this is a simulation, or all of this is just untrue, or you're seeing things entirely different than somebody else. You can't prove in any kind of scientific sense that your senses are reliable. You just run with it, right? Another thing that we tend to just presuppose is like we said, our own existence, right? We presuppose it. Okay, I can't exactly prove that I'm not a brain in a vat or a computer simulation. Nobody can get mathematical certainty on that. But you know what? I'm kind of going to live on the assumption that I'm not a computer simulation. And so you run with that. So human beings will always make presuppositions, and you have to do that in order to function in the world. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to function. You'll dissolve into this lump of skepticism who can't make any moves in life at all because you don't trust anything or anybody, right? So we all make presuppositions. One of the presuppositions that you've got to make in life is that it is in fact possible to get at historical confidence about things that happened in the past. You just have to have that. So for example, I don't have any particular proof, like mathematical proof, that my parents are actually my parents. Now, there's evidence, right? I mean, there's long-standing relationship with my parents. There's a birth certificate. There's pictures of, some baby that looks more or less like me with my parents from a long time ago. And so I can have some evidence that I am, in fact, my parents' son. But the fact is, I can't prove it in any mathematical sense, like you can prove that 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, it is barely possible, let's just be honest, that somebody forged that birth certificate and somebody photoshopped those photos, and, that my memories of my relationship with my parents are not really real, that somebody has implanted them. All of that is barely possible. So there's no mathematical certainty. But my goodness, if that's how we have to do history, then none of us are going to be able to function at all. So what we're going for when we talk about history is not what we call mathematical certainty, like you're going for in physics or mathematics or engineering or any number of fields like that. What we're going for when we're talking about any historical event is historical confidence. So here's the upshot of that. You may walk away from what I'm going to say this morning and say, you know what? That was not a bad case for the resurrection of Jesus, but I still think it's sort of possible that he didn't rise from the dead. I can think of some other things, and I'm just not quite convinced, and it's just not 100% for me, and so therefore I'm not going to act on that 98% certainty that we have on the resurrection. If I'm going to act on the resurrection, if I'm going to act on what this guy is telling me about Jesus, I need it to be 100% mathematically certain. And what I would say to you, if that's your response at the end of this, is, well, that's just kind of not fair, right? I mean, you're not acting with 100% certainty that you even exist. You're acting on historical confidence. You're looking at the evidence and saying, yeah, it looks like, end of the day, I think I exist, and therefore I'm going to act on that. You're saying, you know what, it looks to me like all the evidence sort of suggests that there's historical confidence that in 1789 or whatever it was, the U.S. Constitution was actually ratified by the 13 colonies. So I, therefore, am going to act as if that actually happened, even though I don't have 100% certainty that it did in a mathematical sense. You know, you're even saying that about your parents and your lineage and your identity and all the rest of it. The thing is, you don't need 100% mathematical certainty to act on the basis of historical events. What you need is historical confidence, and then that historical confidence is enough to say, yep, now I'm gonna act on this. I'm gonna act as if this is true and as if I am certain about it. We do that all the time in life, and what I would say to you is that that's the kind of certainty you should have and look for when you look at the resurrection. Now, some people have said, I've heard it said before that make the argument that, well, that's fine, right, for something that's not super important, right? So what I need to do is I need to have less certainty about something that's less important. So, you know, the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. Important on a macro scale, less important for me sort of as an individual just walking around in Louisville, Kentucky. And so because it doesn't have that much effect on my life sort of except from the periphery, it's something that I can act on without too much certainty. But Greg, you're talking to me about something that's like the most important event in the history of the world, the resurrection of Jesus. And so if I'm going to act on the basis of that thing being true, I actually need 100% certainty that happened before I'm going to act on it. Well, what I would say to you, actually, on that argument, if you would make that, or if somebody you know would make that, is I think you've got it exactly wrong. I think you've got that argument exactly backward. I mean, think about it. The things that are most important, the things that have to do with life or death, you actually need to act on with less certainty that they are actually true. It's the things that are matters of life and death that you actually need to act on before you have certainty that they are true. Now, let me tell you why that is. Well, if somebody runs in here waving their hands and, you know, screaming at the top of their lungs that there's a fire in the building and you need to get out, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time verifying that there actually is a fire with mathematical certainty. You're going to get out of the building before you're certain about it. Somebody comes in here and says, you know, there's a dragon out in the parking lot. You know, he's not going to hurt us. He's just here for like 5 minutes and then he's going to fly away. You know, there's no reason to get alarmed by it. But I need you to do this or this thing, you know, in response to this harmless dragon that's out in the parking lot. Well, you're going to kind of run that equation in your mind. Like, well, it's harmless. It's going to be gone in 5 minutes. I'll never see it again. This dude is telling me that there's a dragon, and therefore he wants me to, you know, adopt some worldview about it or whatever. You're actually going to want to do a lot more work verifying whether that dragon was there before you adopt an entire worldview about it, right? Because it's less important. It's going to have no effect. The dragon's here for 5 minutes, then he's gone, and he'll never be seen again. You're going to want to do more work. That's a stupid example, but it's the best I could come up with right now. You're going to want to do more work on that harmless, disappearing dragon because he has no effect on your life before you adopt it than you are on this life or death decision about whether to get out of the building because someone's saying that there's a fire. Does that make sense? That's what I'm saying. I got to come up with a better example than the dragon, but you get my point. All right, so with all that sort of preliminary stuff out of the way, here's how I want to do this. What I want to try to do is build a logical argument for you, first of all, that the documents of the Bible are, in fact, historically reliable, meaning you can trust them and then you can act on them. And then we want to try to build up by the end of the morning to the conclusion that, yep, it's actually historically, we have historical confidence. It's historically likely, like any historian on the planet would look at the evidence of this and say, yep, it actually happened that Jesus got up bodily from the dead. This is not just a religious claim. This is not just a metaphorical claim or a literary claim. Jesus got up from the dead, and history would say, yes, that happened as much as Caesar crossed the Rubicon and as much as George Washington was the first president of the United States. So that's what I want to try to do. Now, the trouble that we've got right from the very beginning is that we've got to determine how do we even get to the point of thinking that those people who said Jesus rose from the dead are reliable? Because there are a lot of charges that are leveled against them, right? People will say, no, those people that wrote about Jesus rising from the dead, they were trying to hoax us. or they were deceiving us, or they were deceived themselves. Maybe they were the subjects of some mass hallucination. Maybe they just got duped. Any number of things could have happened that would cause them to write down that Jesus rose from the dead. Not only that, but you've also got the problem of why are we listening to those people rather than other people? This would be like, why do you do Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John rather than Thomas, for instance, right? Why did you kick those people out and include these? The charge is the reason the ancient church picked these documents rather than this whole cloud of documents out here that was saying different things is because these were saying what they wanted it to say. And so then there was this sort of book-burning crusade to get rid of everything that was a minority report, and you end up with the documents that just agree with the church. That's the charge. It's wholly false, but it's a charge that's leveled against the Bible, right? Another charge that's leveled against the Bible is you don't have the originals. You don't have the pieces of papyrus and vellum and paper and all the rest that they actually wrote on, so you can't know what they said in the first place, right? That's another one. And then another one is, look, the Bible, the documents of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not even written in your language. They were written in another language that doesn't look anything like your language. And so therefore, there are problems of translation. We can't even know, even if we did know what they said in the originals, we can't translate them well enough to know exactly what they said. So there are tons of problems, tons of charges that are leveled against the reliability of the Bible. And what I want to try to do is move really in a kind of reverse history. We want to work backward in the past from ourselves back to the events that happened 2,000 years ago and see if we can get rid of some of those obstacles and charges, right? So here's where we're going. I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I'll do my best. But this little guy right here is us, right? Well, wait, I guess we're going backwards, so let's go backwards. Backwards in time. So this little guy right here is going to be us. Right? And this over here that's an explosion. This is the event, right? And what we want to do is move backwards through time and see several different steps, several different charges that are made. So here they are. We're going to talk about today, at a fairly quick clip, translation, and then what's called transmission. So this would be like, how do we know what they wrote? Like, given that you've got this history of transmission of people copying the original and then copying the copy and perhaps even copying the copy of the copy, right? It's being transmitted through history. How do we know that something hasn't been lost or changed or corrupted or whatever? So questions of transmission, translation, transmission. Then we've got the question, these books, right? Are these the right ones, or should we be looking at the Gospel of Thomas? And isn't there this cloud of writings out there that said different stuff about Jesus, and didn't the church burn them and get rid of them and just give us the books that they wanted us to have? And the answer, of course, is no, that's not true. But we need to ask the question, are these the right books? Then, once we've determined that, yeah, actually, translation is possible, and we can do it well, we do, in fact, know what the originals said. We do, in fact, have the correct books, and there aren't any out there that would be any better, and none of the ones that we have are bad books to have. Then we need to ask the question, okay, well then were the people who wrote them actually trustworthy? I mean, how do we know that they weren't trying to dupe us or pulling off a hoax? Or how do we know that they weren't themselves being hoaxed? Or how do we know that they didn't engage in some mass hallucination and just believe that Jesus was risen from the dead when it wasn't actually true? So we need to ask if those people were trustworthy. And then finally, even if we determined that, yeah, in fact, they were trustworthy, they intended to be writing history, they did it well, they didn't intend to be hoaxing or duping or anything like that, they seem to be historically reliable, we need to ask the question about the event itself. Okay, is it true? I mean, is it possible these trustworthy guys, whose writings we can know and translate, is it possible that they just got it wrong, right? So is it true? So that's where we're headed today. And then what we did last night is finish the argument, which is yes, Jesus actually did in fact rise from the dead. And once you get there, you get to the conclusion that the Bible is the Word of God, right? But we got to get through this first to establish that the resurrection actually happened. So that's where we're going to go. All right. So let's talk about the first. when we come to a text, when you open up your Bible, the first thing that you're confronted with, the very first challenge is, okay, I'm looking at this book and I can read it and understand it, but it's written in English, and the original Bible was not written in English, right? So how do I know that this book has been translated properly? How do I have any confidence even that we can take a language like Greek or Hebrew, which doesn't look anything like English? If you've never seen Greek and Hebrew written on a piece of paper, you should Google it sometime. Just say Greek writing, Hebrew writing, and look at those letters, and then you'll appreciate translators a little bit better, because those words on the page in Greek and Hebrew don't look anything like English letters. So the question is, how do we have any confidence that something that looked like that can actually have meaning in English that says this, right? That's the question. So really, it's a question about translation theory. Can we even do translation? Is it possible to do translation? And what I want to try to convince you of today is that, yeah, it actually is possible to do translation. We're actually really, really good at doing translation. And even the multiple translations that are out there help us to understand how good we are at doing translation, right? So let's do a couple of experiments just to prove to you that translation is possible. Let's see. Anybody speak fluently a foreign language, not English, a non-English language? What language do you speak? French. Anybody else fluently speak French in the room? No, you've got Spanish. I think you may be the only French-speaking person. Yeah, I need somebody who's really good at it. Spanish. Anybody else speak fluent Spanish? All of you guys do. Okay, so I need 2 of you guys to come up here if you're brave. I need 2 brave people up here. 2 brave, and I guess you both speak English too, right? Okay, English and Spanish. And now I need somebody up here who doesn't speak a lick of Spanish. You're not even quite sure what it is. Anybody like that? Come on, be brave. Just admit you don't speak any Spanish and come on up here. All right. Can we use this mic? Okay, here's what I want you to do. I need one person who's going to be the Spanish speaker. So is that you? You'll be the Spanish speaker. You're going to be right up there, the English guy who doesn't speak a lick of Spanish. And you're going to be the translator. Okay?
Oh, man.
All right. So what we're going to do is, what's your name?
Carla.
And your name? Junior? Doug. Okay. Carla, you're going to say in Spanish, you're going to try to tell Doug in Spanish what you had for breakfast this morning.
Okay.
All right? So just a few sentences, just what you had for breakfast, how good it was, all the rest, and then Doug is going to tell us what you said.
Bueno, esta mañana me bebí una taza de café, me bebí un jugo de naranja, también un pedazo de pan con mantequilla y estuvo muy sabroso.
All right. Doug, what did she have? I'm sure you caught the cafe. I got the coffee. What did she have for breakfast?
Can I ask her to say it one more time?
Is that going to help?
No, I think she had a pancake.
Pan. No, that was bread. Pan was bread. That's not bad, though. All right, Junior, I don't want you to just tell him what she had. I want you to kind of translate what she said. I'm sure you can. Roughly.
I had a orange juice with some bread and some butter and a cup of coffee.
There you go. Okay, now, Doug, take the microphone again and tell everybody what Carla had for breakfast.
She had a glass of orange juice, she had some bread and butter, and she had a cup of coffee.
There you go. All right, everybody give him a hand. Good job. All right, so we don't have to belabor that. I think most of you are convinced that translation is not an impossible thing, right? But you just saw an example of that. And what I want you to see is that translation is not just a given, right? It's an amazing thing that we can actually take 2 different languages that do not communicate with each other at all, and we can figure out how to turn one of them into the other. And that's not exactly easy work, especially if it's a brand new language. Let's say you just run up on a brand new language that no one has ever seen before. You've got to then figure out kind of what the symbols are and how this whole thing works and how this word and concept lines up with this one in the target language and figure out how it all goes together. It's not an easy thing, and yet over the centuries we've figured out how to do that. And we're very, very good at doing it in English. Okay, let me try to convince you that that's the case, even though there are. So the question, of course, then is, okay, if we're so good at this, why are there so many multiple translations out there? in the world. You could go to a Bible store, and there are so many different Bible translations out there that it's just bewildering, and it can leave you thinking, well, if we're so good at this translation thing, there are all these different Bibles, and they all say different things, and here's one for teenagers, and here's one for teenage girls and teenage boys, and here's one for soldiers and plumbers, and here's one for pastors, and do they all say different things, right? And the first thing you need to understand is that most of the Bibles that are on the shelves at your bookstore, one for soldiers, one for plumbers, one for guys, one for girls, one for teenagers, one for blah, 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 blah. All of that's just marketing, right? You'll have one translation of the Bible, like the ESV or the NIV or whatever, and they're not changing anything in the actual words of the Bible. What they're changing is the stuff around it, right? The notes or the packaging or whatever, because they're trying to sell it to a lot of different people. So don't let those different sort of, packaging issues confuse you. That's not the point, and the Bible itself is not changing. But you do have different translations of the Bible, right? You've got the English Standard Version, the NIV, the King James, the New King James. Why is all of that there? Well, the answer to the question, why is all that there, is because people use the Bible in different ways. People use the Bible to do different things. So the NASB, for instance, the New American Standard Bible, does translation in what they call a very literal fashion. So Greek's got its words, right? Da, 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 da. And what the NASB essentially will do is translate each Greek word exactly as it appears in the Greek, in the order in which the Greek was put together, right? It'll mostly do that. Now, it doesn't even do that entirely, because if you actually did that, then you wind up with a real problem. So let me show you. So if you take a Bible and turn to Mark 10:50. Mark 10:50. It's just kind of a random verse that I picked out to make this point. So if you took Mark 10:50 and looked at the Greek, and you just translated each word exactly as it appears in the Greek, here's what it would come out sounding like. You got it? Mark 10:50? So just read it, kind of get the idea of what it's saying. Here's what it would sound like if you translated it just literally word for word in the Greek. But he, throwing off the cloak he jumped up, he came to the Jesus. Right? Now the NASB doesn't quite even do that, but it gets closer than other translations like the NIV or the ESV, because it's meant to be used in really serious study of the Bible. And sometimes in serious study of the Bible, you want to know exactly what the Greek word order is, but nobody does it quite like this. The NIV and the ESV, on the other hand, will take some of those words and they'll smooth them out to various degrees so that it's easier to read, right? Because not everybody wants a Bible. If you're doing serious like Greek study, or you're writing a PhD, or you're preparing a sermon or something like that, you sometimes want it to say something like this, then he, but they came to the Jesus, jumped up his cloak, right? You just want to know what the word order is, because that can be important. But if you're just sitting down over your morning coffee and pancake, you don't want to have to muddle through the Bible like that. You want somebody to sort of smooth it out into a sort of English that you can understand. And each one of the English translations of the Bible does that. Now why can those translations of the Bible be super helpful? Well, it's because all of those translations, the good ones, the ESV, the NIV, the NASB, the KJV, and the KJV, all of them are doing really serious work of trying to get the translation right. But what that does is that it allows us to compare all of those good translations with translations that are off. And it allows you to begin sort of combing through and seeing errors that pop up. So, for example, if you pick up a copy of what they call the New World Translation of the Bible, which is the Bible of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and you turn to John chapter 1, verse 1, what you'll read is something like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Right? But you look at any other translation of the Bible, all of them will not say the Word was with God and the Word was a God. They every single one of them say the Word was with God and the Word was God. So that ought to tip you off to, somebody seems to have a bit of an agenda there. And they fixed the translation that actually nobody else thinks is correct. And then you can look into the Greek and find out that actually the New World Translation has got it wrong and everybody else has got it right. So those multiple translations actually help us to sort of sniff out errors in the translations when they show up. And it's super helpful sometimes if you have a question to look at multiple translations and see how people did it. So translation is possible. Translation is a very good thing. And even if you were, if we had time, we'd do another experiment up here where I would have you all, different translations of the Bible, look at Mark 10:50, and we'd all read what our translations say about it, right? And they all say, the thing is, they all say different things, right? So one of them will say he jumped up and ran to Jesus, and another one will say he got up and came to Jesus, right? And the point that I want to make there is, look, they do in fact use different words, but what's going on there is that it's actually giving you a better sense of what happened, not a lesser sense of what happened, because you're getting to look at it from kind of multiple angles. But there's no doubt at all that what happened here is that the man got up and went to Jesus relatively quickly, right? I mean, every single one of them is making that point, even if they're using the richness of the English language to do so. So that's a brief case for this very first step right here, translation. Translation, we can do it, we're really good at it, and in fact, the multiple translations of our Bible help us to sniff out error when they come. Okay, what about transmission? The case is often made that because you don't have the originals of what Paul and Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, because you don't have those original pieces of paper, vellum, papyrus, whatever you want to call them, you therefore cannot know what the originals said, right? Now, I think, just on its face, that can't possibly be true, right? It just doesn't even make any sense that if we don't have the original of something, we can't possibly know that it's true. It just doesn't make sense. My family and I took a trip to London, England, 2 summers ago, I think it was, and went to the British Library, which is a repository of some of the oldest, most amazing documents in the entire history of the world. So they have one of the oldest complete copies of the New Testament in there, dating back to something like 350. I don't remember exactly what. They got copies of Magna Carta, and they've got copies of, the original piece of paper that Handel wrote the Messiah on. Just all this amazing stuff in this room. And they also, in that room, have the original napkin on which John Lennon, or whichever Beatle it was, wrote the song Help. Right next to Magna Carta. Okay, maybe, okay. My point is, though, that we can, in fact, know beyond a shadow of a doubt what the words to the song Help are as John Lennon wrote them. We can, because we have his little napkin there that has those words written out, and it's actually the, help, I need somebody. He actually wrote it out, and you can see that those are, in fact, the words. But does that mean that we cannot know what the words are to any other Beatles song because we don't have the original napkins? No, it doesn't mean that, of course. And it would be ridiculous to think that we can't know what the original words to the songs are because we don't have the original napkin. So just on its face, that charge that you can't know what the original said because you don't have the originals, just I think fails just due to common sense, right? But there's a little more that we can say about that. And what I want to do is give you a very, very brief introduction to what is called, it's a whole field of study called textual criticism. Now, I know that when I first kind of ran into the phrase textual criticism, I thought, well, that's going to be bad, right? That's just a negatively bad thing, because what that's going to be is somebody looking at the text of the Bible and criticizing it, like, I don't like that, or you're stupid, or basically insulting the Bible, criticizing it, criticizing the text. Well, that's not what it means. What it means is to look critically, to look with a critical means careful, right? To look with a careful eye at the text of the Bible to make sure that what we've got is the right text. So text criticism is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, and it helps us massively. Now, how does this work? Well, the truth is we don't have the originals of the Bible, but we do have, in fact, thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of the original that have been made throughout history and really throughout the Roman Empire at the time. So something like 5,400, 5,300, depending on how you count some of them, sort of copies of the Bible that were made from the originals or from copies of copies, right? And these go from way back in the 2nd century, maybe even. We're thinking there may be 1 or 2 that we've got that could be reaching back into the 1st century. And they extend forward into, say, the 300s and 400s AD. So 5,400 of them. And they're being made, right, all over the Roman Empire, some in the east over here in Byzantium, others in the west around Rome. They're all being made in all these different churches. And so there's this group of texts that we've got. Now, how does that help us? How does that help us figure out what the originals of the Bible actually said? Well, here's how it helps. What you can do is actually compare those various copies of the Bible throughout time. And by doing a little detective work, you can figure out why certain changes got introduced into the copy traditions in various places at various times. And if you can figure out why the scribes introduced a change, and then that got picked up and copied again and copied again and copied again, if you can identify, I see why the scribe would have done that. I understand why the scribe would have changed that, or why the scribe would have made that mistake, and then it affected all of these, then you can say, that probably wasn't the original, because I can tell why he would have made that mistake. I can tell why he made that change. So let me give you an example of this. Let's see. Does that like flip really easily? No, not at all. Okay, so some of you in the front will have to help me out here more than the people in the back. So let's say you've got two little fragments of paper, right? And they're old and ancient, but they come from two different places in the empire, or maybe you found them in an old library or something. Two different pieces of paper. You know that they're copies of some original that existed right down here, right behind it, but you don't have the original, so you can't compare the original. But you're just trying to figure out which one of these is the correct reading, which one of these is most likely to have reflected the original. And let's say you've got one of these fragments that has this on it. It says roses are red, R-E-D, right? That's one of your little fragments of paper right there. Your other fragment of paper over here, and you're trying to figure out what the original was, says roses are red, R-E-A-D. Now, which one of those most likely reflects the original? That one right there. And it's not just because we all know the little poem, right? It's because you can do the detective work in your head of figuring out what happened here, right? You can draw a picture. You can tell a story of exactly what happened with roses are R-E-A-D, because you're saying, oh, I see what happened there. There were a bunch of people probably writing this out as somebody read it, and this guy just heard the word red, and he wasn't exactly thinking, and he wrote down the wrong red. Right? He wrote down R-E-A-D instead of the original red. And then you've got the additional piece of evidence that roses are red or roses are reed just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? And so you can sort of throw it out as nonsensical. Okay, so what you say as a detective, as a text critic, is that actually this is most likely the original, right? Roses are R-E-D instead of roses are R-E-A-D. So this is the kind of detective work that scholars do on the fragments that we have of the New Testament on just a much bigger scale, right? They're dealing with more complex problems and they're dealing with, tougher stuff. But it's the same kind of thing. Let me show you one from the Bible, and maybe in the next section, not sure if I want to talk about this anymore, but let me show you one place in the Bible where this kind of work gets done. Turn to Matthew 5:22. We're going to look at this one. So, as we're looking at Matthew 5:22, there are, in text criticism, lots of reasons that scribes made mistakes as they were copying. And sometimes when they made changes, they weren't mistakes at all. They were deliberate changes. So sometimes, what are some of those mistakes? Well, sometimes it's this kind of thing. Because what would happen is that somebody would be at the front of a room full of monks, and they'd be reading the text, and all the monks would be writing it down, and somebody would just mishear a word, and they would write down the wrong word. And then that copy would get picked up by another group of monks who would copy it, and who would copy it, and copy it, and et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes they misheard a word. Sometimes a scribe would be looking at one set of documents, looking at it, reading it, and then he'd go over here and write it down. He would look over here and write it down. Sometimes, if there were two words that were the same, but on a different part of the paper, but kind of at generally the same longitude, their eye would skip down, and they would end up skipping an entire paragraph of text, and they would just keep writing it over here, and that would get picked up, and that's why you have manuscripts where things are missing. Other times they're mistakes. Sometimes they would put a D in where there should have been a B. Sometimes they would put in, a G where there should have been an H. There's just all kinds of mistakes that they make, and you can get at those pretty easily. Other times the scribes would just get a little, they would just get a little arrogant, and they would say, I don't particularly like what that verse of the Bible is saying, and I need to add my own explanation for why it makes more sense than it actually does. So what they would do is sometimes just add another word or two into it in order to clear it up. Sometimes they would put it in the margin, right? They would just make, this is Monk Greg giving his opinion on this. But the next time that thing gets copied, they forget that that's just the margin, and the person who's up at the front of the room will just read it like it's anything else, and it gets copied into the manuscript. So these kinds of things happen all over the place, and what you've got to do as a detective in text criticism is figure out why this change was made and which one of them actually seems to be more like the original. Can I explain why a monk would change it? And if I can explain why the monk would change it, then I can be pretty certain that it was just that monk that did it and that's not what the original said. So look at Matthew 5:22. Okay, here's what our Bibles say. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Okay. I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother. Now, you see that number 2 there, that little footnote? I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother. Number 2, look down at the little footnote at the bottom of your Bible. It says, some manuscripts insert without cause. I say to you, so some manuscripts out there say what we've got. I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. There are some out there, some of these old manuscripts, though, from various places in the empire that say, some manuscripts insert the phrase without cause so that it would say, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother without cause will be liable to judgment. Okay, so how do you figure out which one is the original? Well, let's say you're a monk and you're copying this, and you say you've got the original here, and let's say it's got the words without cause in it. Let's say that's in the original, and you're reading it. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother without cause will be liable to judgment. Why would you take those words out if you're a monk? I don't think there's any good reason to take them out, right? It makes the passage actually much harder to deal with if they're not there, right? If you're only liable to judgment if you are mad at your brother without cause, that's pretty easy to understand. If you're angry with your brother for any reason whatsoever, which is the other reading, then that's a really hard verse. So if the original said without cause, why would you, as a monk copying it, take those words out? I don't think there's any good reason for you to take them out. But what if the manuscript that you're working on doesn't have those words, and you, as the monk, read it, and you're like, really, Jesus? I mean, if I'm angry with my brother because he punches me in the nose, I'm liable to judgment? No, you can't possibly mean that. I'm just going to insert these 2 little words, without cause. Now, that makes more sense, doesn't it? But you can see what's going on there. You can tell what happened there. The original, way more likely, was the harder reading. And some monk decided that it would be better if we just put these 2 little words in. Maybe he stuck them there as a kind of parenthesis to his, for his preaching notes or whatever. But somehow that little fixing of the text got into the manuscript tradition, and therefore we have a few that say without cause. But does that mean we just have to, oh my gosh, some of the manuscripts say without cause and some of them don't say without cause? There's absolutely no way we can figure out what the original said. No, you do this detective work and you can figure out why the monks made the changes and mistakes that they made. Okay, so that's a real simple explanation of what text criticism is. There are a ton of other examples that we could talk about there. But the point is, once you do this hard detective work that scholars spend their lives doing, which are often way more complicated than the examples we've used, what you come down to is that we know, in fact, through doing this detective work, what the transmission history of the text is, and we can tell actually what the originals say. And any part of the text where we're still kind of like, yeah, I don't know, we can't really tell that. There are places like that. We're just not sure. The evidence doesn't really bounce in both ways. We're not sure why the monks would have changed this. We can't figure it out. The point is that there's no place like that in the entire Old Testament that affects or changes Christian doctrine. It's going to be stuff like, was this a plural or a singular? Was this in the aorist voice or the present tense, or was it this or was it that? It's going to be stuff like that. There's no place in the Bible where we're not sure, like whether it said Jesus did rise from the dead or Jesus didn't rise from the dead, right? There's just no place like that or any other Christian doctrine. So we can know what the original said, and even in the places that we're still not sure, for whatever reason, it doesn't affect Christian doctrine. So we know what the original said. Okay, so that's it for this 45 minutes or 53. We're going to come back in a few minutes and finish up talking about canon, trustworthiness, and whether or not the resurrection is true. That's where we're headed.
Let's take about a 15-minute break. I'm just reading a text here for an announcement. Yes, someone has lost their keys and can't find them. Is there anyone who has found keys? If you find keys, please let us know and bring those up here. We'll take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back, and we're going to use the same app and site for questions, sli.do, so you can even now start submitting questions if you've got them. All right, we're going to get started again. Just one little schedule change. We are, you'll see session 4 and then a final talk. We're going to actually use that time up on this talk and the Q&A. There's not going to be a final talk at the end. So any questions that you do have that come up, you're welcome to put there into the app, and then we'll have Greg answer those at the end of this talk, which will be his final talk. So go ahead, Greg.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So what we're doing is, just to remind you, is making our way back through time, really, from ourselves and the Bibles that we have back to the event of the resurrection itself, and trying to determine, first of all, are these documents that we have in the New Testament reliable? Can we trust them? And finally, can we believe what they tell us? So that's where we're going. In the last session, we talked about translation theory. We decided that all the translations of the Bible out there shouldn't throw us, because we're actually really good at translation from Greek and Hebrew. And even though there are a lot of translations out there, the reason they exist is because people use the Bible for different things. And even if you take all those translations and look at them together, they don't leave any doubt as to what's actually happening in any given verse, even if they use different English words. Second, we looked at the idea of transmission. That is, where do all these copies of the Bible come from, and how can all those copies actually help us understand and have a great deal of confidence as to what the originals actually said. And we talked about how you basically do detective work and try to figure out why a particular monk would have introduced a change into the manuscript history. And if you can identify why he did it, then you can basically kick that out and say that wasn't the original, and you go with the other manuscripts. So the example of that we used was Matthew 5:22. Whoever's angry with his brother without cause. Remember, we can sort of guess. Okay, we can see why a monk would insert the words without cause. It's because it makes the verse a whole lot easier to swallow. So therefore, we're going to say that monk was probably the one that messed it up, and the other one, the harder reading, is actually the correct one. Now, once we've established, though, that we can do translation and our translations are good, and we can know what the originals said, we have to ask, do we have the right originals, right? Do we have the right books? Maybe we're not supposed to be looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Maybe we're supposed to be looking at the Gospel of Thomas and the Epistle of Barnabas. Maybe they're the ones who are actually the ones who have it right. And sometime way back in the past, there was some conspiracy in about 350 AD or something like that, where a bunch of monks got together with the Emperor Constantine and decided which books were going to be the ones that were in the canon and which ones weren't. Why did we pick these 27 books and say this is the New Testament as opposed to all those other ones out there? Every Christmas and every Easter, Time and Newsweek and other magazines will run these cover stories, and of course they're trying to sell magazines, but they'll roll out some other, what they describe as an ancient document from the ancient world. We've discovered the Gospel of Judas, and it's going to rock the Christian church, and they'll say, why do we not accept the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of the Epistle of this guy or that guy? Why do we not accept this into the New Testament now? And the reason is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. How many of you read the Da Vinci Code way back in the day? If you read that, not that many, actually. Okay, well, the Da Vinci Code was a fiction book written by an author named Dan Brown, and it just sort of took the world by storm. I'm not exactly sure why it took the world by storm, because on the very first page of that book, Dan Brown says, this book is a work of fiction, and yet for some reason everybody thought it was real, and so they all lost their minds talking about it. Never quite understood that. But there's a case that Dan Brown makes in the Da Vinci Code about the Bible. And I want to read you a little passage from that book where he's explaining his understanding, at least fictionally, of how the Bible came to be. So one of the main characters asks this question in the Da Vinci Code: who chose which Gospels to include? Sophie asked. You don't need to know who Sophie is. Aha! Teabing burst in with enthusiasm. Nobody ever accused Dan Brown of being a great writer, but Teabing is like the smart professor guy. Aha! Teabing burst in with enthusiasm. The fundamental irony of Christianity. He's Scottish. The Bible, as we know it today, was put together by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. And that's T-Bing's explanation for it. He goes on and explains what he means by that. And what he means is that in about the year 325, the evil Emperor Constantine got together with a bunch of other evil bishops of the church at, wouldn't you know it, a seaside resort in the Roman Empire called Nicaea. And they all had a closed-door meeting at which 300 years after the fact, they had hundreds and hundreds of documents laid out in front of them. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, the Epistle of Barnabas. They had them all laid out in front of them on a table, and they went through and decided which 27 were going to be the ones that they chose for themselves. And the others, they launched a campaign to burn and get rid of. And therefore, what we've got in the Bible is not a carefully considered group of books, but we actually have the results of a conspiracy to say what Constantine and that group of bishops at Nicaea wanted us to understand about Jesus. So that's Dan Brown's case. And, it's a bit of a ham-handed way of putting it. But actually, in scholarship, there is an idea and a charge that that's what happened in Christianity. And so the question comes to us, do you have the right books? Why have you decided that these 27 books are your canons? C-A-N-O-N, which just means standard or rule or set of authoritative books. So in order to kind of deal with that question, you got to do a couple of things. The first thing you've got to do is deal with this charge that there was actually this roiling, boiling sea out there of hundreds and hundreds of documents all saying different stuff about Jesus, and that at some point somebody came along and said, we're going to pick these 27 and get rid of those 227, right? You've got to deal with that charge. The second thing you've got to do is actually come up and see if you can figure out, did the early Christians actually have any good reasons for defending the 27 books that they ended up defending, right? So let's deal with those two things one at a time. First of all, was there this roiling, boiling sea of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the Gospels and documents out there in the first place? The answer, historically, is an emphatic no, there wasn't. In fact, the only ancient documents about Jesus that have been dated to the 1st century AD are the documents that we have in the New Testament. All 27 of them have been confidently dated to the 1st century within just a few decades of Jesus' death. And there are no other books other than the 27 that have been dated to the 1st century. So there was not this roiling, boiling sea of Gospels and documents that the early Christians had to deal with. In fact, the next ones that come along are written sometime in about the end of the 2nd century, so 180, 190, 160, 150 AD. And those are written by what we call the church fathers, and they are in almost entire agreement with the documents of the 1st century. So you still don't have anybody popping up as a kind of minority report saying that Jesus was just a teacher, Jesus was this. Those documents don't begin to start showing up, the ones that are sort of challenging Christian tradition, until sometime in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And the reason they're popping up and sort of challenging the tradition is because there is in fact already a tradition in place, and they're trying to break into it. So there's no point at which there's just a table of documents laid out and somebody is picking them. One of the things that you've got to do in this regard is get rid of that idea of a table with a bunch of documents laid out and people picking them in the first place. That's just not the way it worked. The historical situation, which is a whole different story, is actually that you should... So imagine that... Here's how it worked. Imagine that you're just a Christian, right? Or maybe you're a Christian pastor or bishop in the city of, say, Ephesus, right? You're a Christian. Your church has been planted several years ago. Paul came through at some point, planted your church. He went away, and he's doing his own thing. And one day in the mail, there shows up this letter from Paul, the founder of your church, who lived with you for several years. And it's a letter that's written to you and your church there in Ephesus. Now, you've got enough understanding of who Jesus was and what Jesus' teachings were. You've been told these stories about him. And you know that Paul is an apostle of Jesus. And therefore, like we talked about last night, he's authorized to speak for Jesus. So you receive this letter from Paul, and it's from him, obviously. You know his handwriting because you know him. You can hear his voice as he's reading. You know it's from him. And so you read this letter, and you understand that this teaching, you accept it immediately as being the authorized teaching of an apostle of Jesus. And it becomes one of alongside the Old Testament, your church's authoritative rules of how they're going to live their life, right? And you read it to your congregation, you preach from it, because this is authorized stuff from Jesus through Paul, right? So you receive that. At some point, though, you start to hear other traditions from, say, your sister church down the road in Colossae, right? That they have actually received a letter from the same Paul to their church. And so you say, oh my goodness, there's another letter out there that is from the same Paul that we know. Would you take that letter and would you copy it for us and send it to us? And they say, yeah, we'll do that. Will you send us your letter from your church that Paul sent to you in Ephesus and send us that? And so then all of a sudden, both Colossae and Ephesus have the books of Colossians and Ephesus. Right? And you can read them and you compare them and you can see, yep, this is written by Paul. It has the same voice as Paul. It's not teaching anything that's wild. Well, then let's say that somebody pops up and John, right, has written a gospel. It's AD 90. And all of these churches have Colossae and they've got Ephesus and they've got the Thessalonian letters and they've got Galatians and they've all kind of been collated in all these different churches. So then word comes that John, the great apostle, he's old, he's on Patmos, he's like 90 years old now, but he's written a story of the life of Jesus. And so, somebody vouches for him and says, we know John, this is written by him, he's an eyewitness account of who Jesus is, and so you in Ephesus get a copy of the Gospel of John, and you read it and you say, now does this look like John? Well, maybe we didn't know John, but we know these people who say they know John, right? And so we're kind of taking their word for it, and we're lining this up and actually seeing that what John is saying here lines up perfectly with what Paul says in Colossians, Ephesians, Thessalonians, et cetera, et cetera. So it's meeting that. So we're going to accept this too as being authoritative, right? So do you see what's happening here? There's no table on which all these books are laid out, and you're choosing between Barnabas and Matthew, right? There's a standard that's being created because of the apostolic authority of the apostles, and this standard and rule is being built up, right? Well, very, very quickly, the 27 books of the New Testament are established, right? Some of them are established more quickly than others, but essentially you've got this rule of 27. And then let's say you're the pastor of Ephesus. You've got your 27 books, 27 letters of Paul, letters of John, Peter, all the rest. They're all clearly from apostles. They're all saying the same thing. They're all clearly ancient and eyewitnesses, all the rest. They all are just pristine. They're perfect. They're all good, right? They all line up with what the Old Testament teaches. And then let's say that this church in, pick a city, Alexandria, right? Let's say Alexandria, Egypt pops up and says, yo, we got this letter too. It's the epistle to the Alexandrians, and it was written by Thaddeus, the apostle. And so you're giving it a little bit of side eye now because, you're maybe 200, let's say you're not the same pastor as, the original one, but you're 5 generations later, and it's 250 AD, right? 200 years removed from all this. And you're going, oh, really? You've got the epistle of Thaddeus to the Alexandrians. Uh-huh. Okay, why don't you send that to us, and we'll see what we think about it, right? Well, you're looking at it, and let's say you open up the epistle to Thaddeus, and you start reading Thaddeus saying something like, Jesus was actually a pagan priest of the Roman imperial cult or something like that. Just some craziness. These ancient documents say all kinds of crazy stuff about Jesus. Do you get real bothered by the epistle to Thaddeus now at that point? Not really. You're going, this really is not passing the smell test. I mean, first of all, we're 250 years removed from this, and this thing has never showed up anywhere in the world, right? Second, we're pretty sure that this thing wasn't written by Thaddeus because we can tell from, whatever set of evidence that it was actually written 100 years after Thaddeus died. So somebody just stuck his name on it. Third, it's saying things about Jesus that nobody else has ever said, and we know what Paul and John said about Jesus. We know what the tradition about who Jesus was and what he taught was, and this is saying something entirely different. So we're not going to get, all in a wad because this fake epistle of Thaddeus to the Alexandrians says something different. We're just not going to do it, right? So you can see how the canon of the Old Testament built up in a much different way than just having 100 of them laid out on a table and we're just trying to decide what to do. It's just not the way it worked. The early Christians received books from the authorized apostles, right? And as they did, and as those letters became part of a standard, other books had to sort of compare themselves to that standard in order to be included. And either they were or they were kicked out for various reasons. So turning to the second question, once that standard is created, or even once it's sort of being created over the first 100 years of Christian history, how did the early Christians decide whether to include something in that? How did they defend their standard once it was created, right? So when somebody came to them and said, listen, I think the epistle of Thaddeus to the Alexandrians deserves to be in the canon of Scripture. How did they defend their standard, and what criteria did they use to say, no, the epistle of Thaddeus doesn't belong, right? How'd they do that? On the other hand, when somebody came and said, look, I do not think that the letter to the Hebrews belongs in the Christian canon. I think we should kick that one out. How, again, did they defend their canon? How did they defend it? What reasons did they use for saying, no, these are the books and these other ones are not the books? How did they do that? Well, let me tell you how they did it. You can tell in all over the place as the Christians are talking about this, because they talked about it a lot. And we have some of their writings where they're describing, here's why this one is in and this one is out and blah, 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 blah. And you can actually look at those documents and come up with essentially 4 tests that they used for defending their canon. 4 tests that they used for defending their canon. I'm going to give you all 4 of those. If you ever want to take a deep dive look at this, there's one document in particular called the Muratorian Canon, Muratorian, Muratorian Canon, where this fella lays them all out in about as much detail and in as much organization as you're going to get. And he explains how each of these tests work, and you can see them all, and it's fascinating to see how he does it. But here are the 4 tests, and they're kind of in order of importance. Number 1, the apostles were looking for what we call apostolicity. Apostolicity, apostolicity, apostolicity. And what they meant by that was that they wanted the books to be written by an apostle. Now, we talked a little bit, let me qualify that just a little bit. There are some books in the Bible that were in the New Testament that were not written by apostles, but what we figured out is that the reason they were accepted, Luke, for instance, Luke is not an apostle, but Luke is understood to be the spokesman of Paul. He was with Paul. He learned from Paul. Paul was his mentor. And so it's understood that what Luke is writing and talking about, he's learning from Paul. And so he's seen as the sort of scribe of Paul, and Luke and Acts are therefore understood to be apostolic because they're coming from Paul. So you got to either be an apostle or a very close associate of an apostle, such that you are kind of the mouthpiece of that apostle. They were looking for that. Now, why were they looking for that? Well, we've talked about it a couple of times. The reason they were looking for that, just historically, number 1, is because if you want to understand who Jesus is and what he did and what he taught, you want people who are eyewitnesses to the fact, right? That's just the best thing you can do. You don't want to take the testimony of people who are 100 years removed. You want to know, I want somebody who actually saw it and will vouch for the fact that they saw it. And so that's part of the reason they were doing that. The more important reason, though, is that they heard Jesus' teaching in John 16, that he was going to authorize these particular men to speak for him. And remember, what the Father has, he gives to me. What I have, I give to the Spirit. What the Spirit has, he's going to give to you. And what you have, you're going to give to the church. Right? It's just this chain of knowledge and authorization that runs not to anybody in the world, but to these people right here who have seen Jesus and been specially called by him to be apostles. And so that's why they're looking for apostolicity. A ton of books in the that Newsweek and Time will pop up with every once in a while failed this test right off the bat. Because the apostles or the early church could look at it and say, there is absolutely no way that book was written by an apostle. One of the things that's interesting about these old books is that they'll be written, but they'll have a fake name on them. You ever heard of this? It's called pseudepigraphy, fake writing, pseudepigraphy. And what they'll do is people will write a book, and then they'll try to pass it off as being the work of the apostle John or the apostle, Thomas or Barnabas or whoever. They'll put a fake name on it. Now, why are they doing that? I mean, if you want to write a book about Jesus, say it's 150 AD or whatever, you're 100 years removed, you want to write a book about Jesus and try to stir things up, why don't you just put your own name on it, right? And just get it going. Well, because you know that if it's got your own name on it, 100 years removed, there's not a chance in the world it's ever going to be accepted as authoritative. Because the whole Christian church is looking for things that were written by apostles. So if you're going to have any chance in the world of getting your little fake book accepted, you're going to have to dupe everybody into thinking it's written by an apostle. Well, that happens all the time. So that's why you can have a Gospel of Thomas that's written 200 years after Thomas died. It's because somebody's lying about it to try to get the thing in. right? So that's the first test, apostolicity. The second test is very closely related to that, and that is antiquity. Antiquity. In other words, it's got to be old. And why does it have to be? In other words, it's got to come from the first century. It's got to come from within the first few decades of Jesus' life. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? Why wouldn't they accept a new book? Well, they wouldn't accept a new book because all the apostles died a long time ago, right? That's what they were saying. And if your book is brand new, then there's no way it was written by an apostle. And so if we can tell that it's brand new, we're not going to accept it, buddy. Right? And they would do this kind of thing with everything from the paper to the ink to date stamps to all kinds of things. Like, people would show up and say, I have a Gospel of Thomas or a Gospel of, this person or that person. And, the bishops of the church, the pastors would look at it and go, yeah, but there's a watermark here that says this paper was made like last year. Right? So, and take that away. We don't even have to think about it anymore. It's got to be antique. It's got to be old, right? And so lots of books would fail because they're just not apostolic. They're not antique. In fact, in the Muratorian canon, there's this, I think it's funny. Many people don't think it's funny, but there's this one where there's a book that's under consideration. It's called The Shepherd of Hermas. They reject it. The Muratorian canon, the guy who writes that argues that we should reject the Shepherd of Hermas getting into the canon, and he says, look, the reason we're not going to accept it is because it's like 400 AD at this point, and the guy says, we all know who Hermas is. He's that guy that lives right down the street, and he wrote it, and therefore it's not old and it's not apostolic, so we're not going to accept it. You can't just pop up and write a new book and claim that it belongs in the New Testament, right? So that was the second thing that they used. Just incidentally, this is super useful to us, right, as Christians today. Those two criteria, all by themselves, are super, super useful to us. So let's just say that on the off chance, there's a fellow named, Joseph Smith, who pops up in the 19th century and says, I have been inspired to write a brand new book that comes as the Word of God and belongs right next to the New Testament. And let's just call it, the Book of Mormon. What do Christians do with that? We say, not a chance, buddy. You fail on criteria number one because you, Joseph Smith, are not an apostle, right? You've never seen Jesus, and Jesus has not specially commissioned you to be an apostle. That's finished. He did that already a long time ago, and that doesn't happen anymore. And second, we're not going to accept your book because it's not old. It's just there's no way it goes back to the apostles. We're not going to let that happen. So we kick it out. Okay, third criteria that they use to defend their canon. There's apostolicity, there's antiquity, and then there was orthodoxy. Orthodoxy. In other words, everybody knew from the very beginning what Jesus said and what Jesus taught. He taught in aphorisms, he taught in parables, he taught in very memorable sayings. That's why you have many of them if you're a Christian and have been for a long time. You have many of them memorized. That's the way he taught, and people remembered that, right? And so for the first few years before Paul began to write his letters, people were teaching each other the teaching of Jesus, and it became very widespread known what Jesus actually taught and what he said. And so when Paul began to write and say, I'm an apostle, here's a book to Ephesus, the first thing that would happen is that they determined that it was Paul. The second thing is they would determine, of course, antiquity wasn't really until later, but they determined that it was apostolic. And then they would say, okay, let's make sure now that what Paul is saying lines up with what we know Jesus to have taught already. So if Paul even had written something that departed from Jesus' teachings, the church would have kicked it out. They would have said, no, we know what Jesus taught. Like, everybody knows this stuff. We've known it for decades. So how are you going to pop in and say something that's different from what the king says? That's not going to work. But what they realized is that everything that is said in the letter to the church at Ephesus lines up with what they knew Jesus to have taught already. And so it slides in and becomes part of that standard itself, right? They get word that Mark has written a gospel. And so it shows up. They determine that it's actually from Mark, who is an associate of Peter, right? And they line it up and they see, okay, does this line up with what we already know to be the case about Jesus? If it did not, then they would kick it out and say, no, we know that Jesus, didn't do what you're saying he did. He did this instead. But they see Mark's book and they say, no, this lines up perfectly. This is the account of Peter with reference to Jesus' life. And so, it slides in and becomes part of the standard too, right? And then this happens over and over again. Orthodoxy means that what these books are teaching lines up with what they already know to be the case, right? So if a book pops up and says something crazy off the wall, they'd kick it out because it was not orthodox. This is actually the case with the Gospel of Thomas. I don't know why the Gospel of Thomas is the one that Time and Newsweek always like to do, but it is. They like the Gospel of Thomas for whatever set of reasons, but it fails at, like I said last night in the Q&A, it fails literally at every point. It wasn't written by Thomas. It wasn't written anywhere near the first century. And on this point of orthodoxy even, it says some absolutely crazy things that I can't even believe the media would want to sort of use as their challenge. So, for example, here's a passage from the Gospel of Thomas. This one's a lot of fun. Simon Peter said to them, to the rest of the apostles, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." And Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her, in order to make her a male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." That's the Gospel of Thomas that Time and Newsweek desperately want to try to stick into the canon of the New Testament. And the early church would have read that, and they would have said, "That's ridiculous. Jesus never taught anything like that, and so therefore you fail not only at apostolicity and antiquity, you fail at orthodoxy, because we know Jesus never taught that. In fact, he taught exactly the opposite in certain places." So the Gospel of Thomas fails in that sense too. Okay, so those are three of the tests. The last test that was useful to them was the the test of universality. So it had to be apostolic, it had to be antique, it had to be orthodox, lining up with what we already know to be true of what Jesus taught, and also it had to be widely used and circulated. So by, say, 250 AD, 350 AD, if somebody pops up out of Alexandria with their little private letter that they think they've got from Peter or whatever, at that point, that late, the whole church is giving the side eye to that book, because they're saying there is no way that there is a legit letter from Peter hanging out in your little church that is authentic but hasn't been seen or used by anybody else 300 years on. Now that is much less. Is there going to be some letter that shows up that has been, the private property of some little church in, some country that for 2,000 years has not been in wide use? So, often the question will be asked, well, what if we find Paul's old letter to the Laodiceans, right? What if we dig into some ancient, cave or whatever monastery, and we find the letter to the Laodiceans? How would we analyze that? Well, for some people, it would throw them. It's like, oh my gosh, how do we deal with this? My faith is being rocked because I don't know whether to include this letter. Well, we would run the same analysis on it that the early church ran on every other letter that popped up and purported to be from Paul or Peter or Barnabas, right? We would say, okay, do we think this is apostolic? And the answer to that is going to be, we have absolutely no idea. I mean, there's just absolutely going to be no idea whether or not this thing was written by Paul. So it's basically going to fail on that account right there, because we just can't know. It may be a forgery. Even if you could date it, way back, it's still not going to quite rise to the level of us being able to say, yeah, this is from Paul. Now, you might say, oh, it kind of sounds like Paul, but you're never going to be sure, right? Antiquity, it might or might not pass that test. If it's old enough, maybe you could date it to the first century. Maybe you'd find out that carbon dating and everything else, wow, this paper actually looks like it's from 60 AD, right? This thing is antique. Okay, check, maybe it is antique. Orthodoxy, that would be pretty easy to figure out, right? Does it say what we already know to be the truth about Jesus? That would be a great question to ask of it, and it might get a check mark or not on that test, right? So you've got a question mark, a check, maybe you've got a check. What about the fourth one, universality? It just fails. It fails like right off the bat, because you've had millions and millions and millions of Christians for 2,000 years who have done just fine without the lost letter to the Laodiceans. And so just like the early church would kick out any book that wasn't in universal use or widespread use, so we would not allow the canon to be changed by some new book purporting to be the lost letter to the Laodiceans. It might be super interesting to read, right? It might be super interesting to look at from a kind of historical matter, but we wouldn't allow it into the canon because it doesn't pass all four of those tests with flying colors. Now, here's the thing. Here's what I want to push on you about this. There are 27 books in the New Testament. All 27 of those books pass those 4 criteria with flying colors. Every single one of them is without a doubt apostolic, is without a doubt antique, is without a doubt orthodox. In other words, it lines up with the standard of Jesus' teaching that we've all always known, and they were all in widespread use. Every single one of them passes all 4 of those very reasonable tests. Of the other books that exist that we know of that might be laid on the table as candidates for inclusion in the New Testament, 0 pass all 4 of those tests. So there are 27 books that pass them and 0 outside of it that pass them. So my question to you, if you have this question, are these the right books, would be, okay, I actually think those 4 criteria are pretty good and reasonable criteria for defending your canon, right? I think they're pretty good. I think if you're looking for legitimate, reliable information about Jesus, you probably want to go with people who are eyewitnesses of him. You probably want to go with the old documents because those are the ones that could have been written by the eyewitnesses. You probably want to make sure that the people who are writing are saying things that line up with what we already know to be true about Jesus. And you probably want books that aren't just popping up out of nowhere and making this claim. You probably want things that are widespread and have a wide base of sort of recognition, right? So my question to you, if you would question that canon, is, okay, what criteria would you come up with that would be more reasonable? Even from a historical standpoint, what criteria would you come up that would be more reasonable? And I think you'll be really hard-pressed to come up with some criteria that would be better than those. So I think at the end of the day, there's always more you could say about these things. I'm just giving you an overview. But I think at the end of the day, we can say, yeah, we do in fact have the right books. We've got the ones that were written by eyewitnesses, by apostles. We've got the ones that don't say silly stuff like women need to become males in order to become a part of the kingdom of God, right? And we've got those that had widespread use and support. 27 books passed those tests. 0 outside of it passed those tests. Okay. Trustworthy. So once we've determined that, yeah, we can do translation, we do know what the original said, we're sure that we've got the right, correct ones to look at, how do we know that these guys who wrote these books were even trustworthy? How do we know that we can rely on them to give us reliable information about Jesus? Isn't it possible that something else was happening there? Isn't it possible that they were, for example, well, there's a few possibilities. One possibility is maybe the New Testament writers were, just writers of fiction. Maybe like any fiction writer, they intended to be writing fiction, and everybody around them knew that they were just writing this fictional story about this fictional character named Jesus who never really existed but is a good story. And we, 2,000 years on, just don't get the joke, right? We're treating it as if it's real, but actually the apostles and everybody else knew that it was fiction. Maybe that's what's going on. Some scholars have said that. Maybe, on the other hand, the disciples are trying to pull off a hoax on us. Well, maybe they're doing something to. Let's write these down because we're going to go through each one of them. We'll get rid of the resurrection for a second. Okay, so first possibility, maybe they're writers of fiction, right? We're trying to determine if they're trustworthy. Maybe they were writers of fiction. Maybe they're trying to pull off a hoax, right? Maybe they themselves were duped, right? Let's just go through those and see if we can figure out what, if any of those are plausible. First of all, maybe they were just writers of fiction and we're just not in on the joke. The problem with saying that is that it's really clear from what they're actually writing that they're trying with everything they've got, every fiber of their being, to convince us that they're actually writing history, and fiction writers don't do that. Ancient fiction writers and even modern fiction writers will always give us some indication in their book and in the writing of it that they're writing fiction and not history. And they don't go out of their way to try to convince you that they're writing history. I mean, it's like the Da Vinci Code, right? At the very beginning of the book, it says this is a work of fiction, and any, resemblance to figures living or dead is accidental, so please don't sue me. That's what he's saying. So they'll tell you that they're writing fiction if that's actually what they're doing. The gospel writers are totally different, though. So I mean, you can just look at, say, You can just look at, say, the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, where Luke is just going out of his way to say, I'm writing history. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some times past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught, right? I mean, he's just straight up trying to convince this guy Theophilus, that he's writing history. I've studied this. I've made an inquiry into it. I've gathered up the evidence and the stories. I've pulled it all together, and I've written for you, O most excellent Theophilus, an orderly account of the things that happened so that you can be sure of the things that you've been taught. In other words, all these stories that you've heard in the oral tradition about Jesus, I'm pulling them all together, talking to Paul, and we're putting them together into this orderly account for you. He's writing history. I mean, John does the same thing, right? He says at the end of his gospel, he says, look, the things that Jesus did, they could fill up the whole world could be filled up with the books that could be written about the things that Jesus did. But I'm writing these things to you so that you may believe that he is the Son of God. He means for you to believe him and then to believe in Jesus because you believe him. Another thing about Luke, let's see. I got to find this particular. Okay, Luke chapter 2. You can look at it if you want to, or I'll just read it to you. I want you to notice all of the historical references that Luke makes in these first few verses of chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. Somebody's counted them all up and found out that there are 23 different historical verifiable or unverifiable, falsifiable references to actual events that were going on in the ancient world in those 5 verses, 23 of them. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because fiction will often include historical references that are verifiable or falsifiable, and you can go verify them or falsify them, right? So, for example, my kids and I and my wife are in the process of watching all 7 seasons of the hit show 24. Anybody ever watch 24? Yeah, some of you are. It's about this counter-terrorist guy who does his thing. Anyway, in 24, there's a series through the 7 seasons of it. There's a series of presidents of the United States, right, who show up in this show. One of them is named President Palmer. Another one is after President Palmer gets killed. Then there's President Logan. After President Logan turns out to be a terrorist spy, there's a president. This person. It's a crazy show. Anyway, a series of presidents. Palmer, Logan, I forget the name of the next one. Anyway, the thing is, those references are, if you are wondering if the hit show 24 is historical or not, if it's telling a true story, it makes enough historical references, like to a person named President Palmer, that you can go to the historical record and ask the question, I wonder if there actually was a President Palmer of the United States of America. And you can find out that so far, there hasn't been, right? And so you can say, okay, this show is probably not trying to tell me a historical account of what happened. This show is telling a fictional story, and it's taken a real office and filled it with a fictional character. And therefore, I can be sure that this is fiction, right? And intended to be fiction. Well, Luke seems to be going out of his way here to use historical references that are verifiable or falsifiable precisely so that you can go back and check, was there actually a Caesar Augustus? Did this Caesar Augustus actually put out this decree in the years during which Quirinius was governor of Syria? Was there a place called Galilee and a little town called Nazareth? And was that town, Bethlehem, called the city of David, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You can verify and falsify all of those things. And what you find out as you look at the historical record is that every single one of them checks out. right? Now, it took some time for us to verify each one of those things. There was some doubt about Quirinius for a little while, but we've actually found out, after all, it turns out there was a Quirinius of Syria right about the correct time. Now, there was some weirdness with his marriage that made us sort of lose him for a little bit, but he pops back out of the historical record eventually, and there is, in fact, a Quirinius of Syria. Anyway, the point is, Luke is writing history. And you can look through all the other writings of the New Testament, and you can get rid of this idea that they were writers of fiction deliberately, and that we're just not getting the joke. That's not what was going on. Well, what about a hoax? I mean, is it possible that the apostles, the early writers of Christianity, were trying to pull off a hoax on us? Well, I don't think so, and there are a few reasons why that just doesn't hold any water historically. One of the reasons that it doesn't hold water is because all of the documents of the New Testament were written and sort of publicized. They didn't exactly publish them. To publish something was just to like walk out your front door and say, I'm done. That's all you could do. But they were publicized. They were copied and sent around the world and all the rest. Within just a few decades of Jesus resurrecting and ascending into heaven, or if you're not ready to buy that yet, of his life, right, when he was alive. And there were lots of eyewitnesses still alive and around who were reading those books, including enemies of Christianity who didn't want it all to be true. And what you find in the historical record is that even the enemies of Christianity, when they read these accounts of Jesus' life and when they read the letters of the apostles that talked about Jesus' life, they never, ever, ever, even the enemies, never, ever, ever contradicted the factual claims that were made. Nobody ever said, oh my gosh, you guys are absolutely full of it. There never was anybody named Jesus. There never was a teacher named you. You are making this up. You're trying to pull this over on us. They didn't even say things like, what are you talking about? Jesus got married and had 4 kids and lived out his life in old age and died, and we buried him in the temple. Nobody ever said anything like that. In fact, nobody even ever said, no, Jesus was not resurrected. His body is right here in the tomb where we left it. Nobody ever said that kind of stuff. When they argued against Christianity, what they argued against was the significance of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which is fascinating because they never argued the facts, just the significance of the facts. They would say things like, yeah, okay, Jesus lived, died, resurrected, all of that, fine, we're not going to argue with that. What we're going to argue with is that it actually means anything. It's fascinating, isn't it? So all those books were written within a few decades while there were still eyewitnesses, including enemies of Christianity. Nobody ever contradicted them. And it would have, if the apostles were pulling off some kind of a hoax, it would have been very easy for other eyewitnesses who weren't in on the hoax to falsify them and say that they weren't true. Another thing that just sort of works against this whole idea of a hoax is that if you're trying to pull the wool over the world's eyes and convince everybody that Jesus is the Lord of life, and that you're his special people and all the rest, why do you, if you're trying to convince everybody that you're like a special leader of this resurrected guy, and that you ought to be honored, therefore, and made wealthy and all the rest of it, and be the powerful leader of this new church, why do you keep making it so clear to everybody that you're an absolute tool? Like the apostles, even in their own writings, keep making themselves out to be absolutely foolish, dense people. Why do you air out your dirty laundry so much if you're trying to pull off a hoax? Nobody does that. I mean, you read through the book of Acts, and Luke, who's the spokesman for Paul, airs out all of Paul's dirty laundry. He talks about how Paul and Silas get into this massive fight with one another, and they end up splitting apart, and then Silas comes sort of crawling back to Paul, and Paul kind of nastily says, no, I don't want you with me anymore. Right? I mean, why do you, if you're Paul and Peter and you're trying to pull off a hoax that you are the people who need to be honored, why do you allow the dirty laundry about your fight about eating with Gentiles to be aired to the whole world? For that matter, if you're trying to make Jesus look so good, why do you put him in positions that so often kind of make you look side-eye at him like, what's going on there? Like, why does it take Jesus 2 shots at the miracle of making the guy see again? You don't write that if you're trying to make Jesus out into a superhero, right? I mean, it never takes Thor 2 shots to destroy the enemy that he's got. That's not how you write superheroes. You have Jesus say something, rub a little mud on the eye, snap his fingers, and bam, the dude can see. But Jesus sort of messes it up, right? He can only see halfway. And then Jesus kind of has to, let me do it again, and he fixes it. Now, there's a reason behind that, right? But the point is, that reason is sort of buried, and you have to get to it theologically. But if you're just trying to convince everybody on the first shot, Jesus is awesome, you don't have him messing up like that. Same thing with the woman touching his robe and being healed of the issue of blood. Why don't you have your superhero, fake Jesus, know immediately who touched him? Why is he not sort of the grand hero of the story who knows everything? But no, you've got him being touched and then sort of turning around going, wait a second, I'm the Lord of the universe and all the rest, but who did that? It doesn't make any sense unless it happened. It only makes sense that you would write those sort of foibles into the story if they actually happened. If you're trying to make up a fake superhero story, you just don't put that kind of stuff in there. So is it a hoax? I don't think it's a hoax. They're just not trying to do that. Well, what about were they duped? Actually, let me look something up real quick. I want to make sure I said everything I wanted to say about that. Oh, yeah. One more thing about the hoax thing. If the apostles are pulling together a hoax, trying to hoax the world, what exactly was their goal? I think I mentioned this last night. What was their goal? Was it to get wealthy? Was it to get powerful? Was it to get honored? Were they supposed to be the great leaders of this powerful new church in the Roman Empire? I mean, whatever goal you come up with, you have to come to the conclusion historically, just given what happened to them all, that they were utter and abject failures in that goal, right? None of them got wealthy. None of them got powerful. None of them became influential in the empire. In fact, they were all killed in really horrible ways. And yet, right up until the very end, decades and decades and decades into this hoax, with their dying breaths, they were still saying, this is all true. Right? I mean, just think about it. If you're trying to pull a hoax off on the world, and you've been working on it for 40 years, and it's not working, right? You're not wealthy, you're not powerful, you're not influential the way you hoped. It's just absolutely not working. And then somebody puts a sword to your throat and says, look, I'm either going to kill you or you're going to admit that this is a hoax. Nobody dies for a hoax at that point. Nobody does. You give it up at that point. But none of these guys did. They all died these horrible deaths, and to their last breath they were saying, this is true, this is true, this is true. So it wasn't a hoax. Historically, there's just no way it was a hoax. Well, maybe they were themselves duped, right? I mean, lots of different things have been said about that. Maybe some say they were the victims of mass hallucination. But of course, if you got any training at all in psychology, you know that mass hallucination is an utter impossibility unless you believe in some sort of ESP, right? That brains can talk to each other. Because by definition, a hallucination is a purely subjective internal thing that happens in your brain. And yet you've got these stories in the New Testament of Jesus appearing to 3 people, then 12 people, or 11, Judas is dead by now, and then 40 people, and then 500 people. Well, are they all having the same hallucination at exactly the same time? Are they all having the same hallucination repeatedly? I mean, did these 12 or 11 guys have the hallucination first that Jesus was in the room with them and talking to them? Then did they have the exact sort of same hallucination, only this time on a beach around a campfire where Jesus roasts a piece of fish and then eats it? I mean, is it possible that 12 people are having precisely the same hallucinations over and over again? And then is it possible that 500 people are having a single mass hallucination that they saw Jesus all together? I don't think so. It just doesn't make sense, and mass hallucination is a nonsensical thing psychologically in the first place, right? So they're not duped. They're not the victims of mass hallucination. Some people have said, I mean, a kind of variation on that theme is that, well, it was wishful thinking, right? They were heartbroken by the fact that Jesus had died. They had all their hopes in the sky, and so it's just sort of wishful thinking. This is their way of moving on with life. They just sort of put it together in their own heads. Oh, no, he's alive, and I'm just going to, Denial is more than a river in Egypt, right? I'm just going to deny that he died. He is alive, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Wishful thinking. Well, the problem with that, though, is that if that's what they were going to do, they wouldn't have come up with the idea of resurrection for that. I mean, resurrection was a thing. It wasn't a new idea when Jesus resurrected from the dead. The Jews had something that they called resurrection, and they knew precisely when and where it was going to happen. That resurrection was going to happen at the end of time when God came to judge the world. That's when it was going to happen. So if you're just doing, I mean, you can see that in John 11, right? Jesus says your brother is going to rise again. And Martha says, I know he's going to rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She knows that it's coming. She knows her brother's going to rise again in resurrection. It's not a new thing that the Christians invent. So if they're victims of sort of wishful thinking, if they just can't handle the death of Jesus and they need something else, they're not going to grab something that literally everybody in their nation is familiar with and try to redefine it as something that happened to one guy yesterday, right? That just, everybody would just go, that is so stupid. You can't do that, right? Because they know what that is. No, they're going to come up with something else, right? They're going to come up with something other than resurrection. But what they start to realize is that there's no other way to explain what we have experienced. We saw the empty tomb and we saw the resurrected Jesus, and he can do stuff like walk through walls. There's nothing else that explains that other than that thing that we thought was going to happen at the end of time has happened early to this guy. And thus Paul will say things like he's the first fruits of the resurrection, right? It's not wishful thinking. It blows their minds that this has happened to Jesus. And you can see that in the way they react, right? Thomas is saying, I will not believe that this has happened unless I can see his body and touch his hands and touch his side. I won't do it. And he's not gullible. He's not duped. So they're not guilty of wishful thinking, and they're not guilty of some mass hallucination. So at the end of the day, if that's true, if all of this is the case, that they weren't writers of fiction, they weren't pulling off a hoax, and they weren't duped, then I think we can say, yeah, look, these guys are trustworthy. I mean, they tell us that they're writing history. They're not trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They really intend for us to believe that they saw the things that they say they saw. Now, I know that if you're skeptical about it, you can always say, yeah, okay, all right, pretty good case. But man, there's always the chance. There's always the chance that they're hoaxing you and they just did it so well that they got you. There's always the chance. Okay, fine. But at that point, you're talking about mathematical certainty and not the kind of historical confidence that we've got. And what I would put onto you is that, there is always the chance that we're dealing with some Manchurian candidate thing here, where the dupe is just so stinking good that nobody will ever be able to penetrate it. But at that point, I'd say, yeah, you're the one that's sort of dealing in wishful thinking at that point. You're trying to defend your skepticism against good evidence. And it's not me who's engaged in creating a story. It's you rewriting the script of the Manchurian candidate. So I think we've gotten to the point where we can say our translations are good, the transmission is good, we know that we've got the right books, and actually we can say that the disciples are trustworthy. So I think what we've gotten to is the conclusion that the books of the Bible that we have are historically reliable. In other words, we can look at them and we can trust them as being historically reliable. Now, there's one more question, though, even after you've gotten to the fact that you've gotten to the point that, we're not being duped. These guys really believe what they say they believe. They're not writing fiction, none of that. There's no error that keeps us from knowing what they were saying. The next big question, though, is, okay, but still, is it true? Is it true? Is it true? Right? I mean, there have been times when you, as a trustworthy person, I'm sure if you think back on your life, there have been times when you, as a trustworthy person, have sworn up and down that you saw something happen, right? And you're generally historically reliable, right? You're not lying. You're not trying to write fiction. You really believe what you're saying. You're just wrong. You're just flat wrong. You just messed it up. Well, is that possible? That these guys are historically reliable. We know what they said. We don't think they're duping us. We don't think they're hoaxing us. We don't think they're writing fiction. We think they're reliable. Is it possible they just got it wrong? That something else happened other than resurrection that caused everything that happened after that, and we've just all got it wrong. Is that possible? Well, a lot of scholars throughout history have said that's exactly what happened. That whatever happened on that Sunday morning, and it had to be something. Everybody agrees with that, right? Because here we are in, one of millions of Christian church buildings that exist around the world. And it all, if you trace it back historically, it all goes back to that Sunday morning when the disciples said they found an empty tomb and then saw Jesus, right? There's this explosion that happens throughout world history. Something happened on that Sunday morning that caused it all to happen. And the question is, what was it, right? Well, Christians say the thing that caused that nuclear explosion on that Sunday morning was that Jesus was resurrected. Scholars who are skeptical will say, no. It couldn't have been resurrection because resurrection doesn't happen. There's just no way that can possibly be the case. So let's come up with some other explanation that could explain everything that happened. What is it that could have happened on that Sunday morning that will explain everything just as well as the idea, they would say false, of resurrection, right? So this is how you do history, actually. This is just basic historical methodology. You see the effects of some event, and maybe the event that is claimed to have happened seems a little bit far-fetched. It seems a little bit strange. And then historians go to work. They hammer and tongs that sucker, and they try to figure out, okay, let's try to figure out if we can come up with some other explanation for what happened other than this crazy one that you all are talking about, right? And they go after it, and they say, okay, well, instead of this happening, maybe this happened. And then eventually, most of the time, they'll hit upon some explanation that explains it all. Right? They'll come, like for example, the pyramids in Egypt, for instance. There are crazy theories about how the pyramids in Egypt got built. And for a while, there were people saying that the stones are too big and the angles are just too severe, and therefore they had to have technological help, and so therefore it was aliens that came and helped them build the pyramids. Just all kinds of theories about how the pyramids got built. Well, then eventually somebody comes along and offers the explanation, I don't know all the details of it, but that there was a particular kind of tool that the Egyptians invented during this time that would allow them to move these heavy stones up at these particularly severe angles. And then you're left thinking, okay, so if that explains how the pyramids got here, it was just a tool made out of ropes and wood and that kind of stuff. That explains everything. Let's go with that rather than aliens. You can do that. So scholars have tried to do that kind of thing with the resurrection. They've tried to say, we don't buy the resurrection. Let's try to come up with some other explanation that makes everything clear, and we'll go with that when we find it. Okay, so what are those? Well, let's talk about it. First of all, let me say something first before we get to these. We'll just write it up here. Other explanations for what happened after that Sunday morning. There's going to be a bunch of them. Other explanations. But first, let me just say something about the idea of miracles, first of all. Just things that are supernatural. A lot of people start with the assumption that the supernatural cannot and will not happen, and therefore that is why they rule the idea of the resurrection out of order right off the bat. I start with a presupposition that the supernatural cannot happen, and therefore I say, because the resurrection is something supernatural, and the supernatural never happens, cannot happen, therefore the resurrection could not have happened. Right? They try to do that. Now there are lots of reasons why that's illegit. There's a philosophical objection to miracles that fails. There's a scientific objection to miracles that fails. Lots of different things that fail. We don't have time to talk about all that. What I want to say to you about that, though, is a little more human, and it is that, is it possible that that miracles seem implausible to you, not because they are in fact impossible, but because they are just outside of your experience? Is it possible that miracles seem implausible to you, not because they are in fact impossible for some reason, but because they're simply outside of your experience? You talk to a lot of Christians, and you ask a Christian, what do you think about miracles? And they're really quick to say, yeah, of course miracles happen. Miracles happened in the past, and miracles happen now, and presumably miracles will happen in the future. Why? Because those Christians would say, because miracles are inside the realm of my experience. I know them from the Bible. Some people even say, some Christians will say, I know miracles in my own life. Of course they happen. Maybe it's just that it's not in your experience. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine that you've got a guy, and let's say this is the 17th century. Let's just go way back before you've got a whole lot of modern technology. And you've got a guy, he has lived his entire life on a tropical island right at the equator of the earth, where the temperature never goes below, say, 70 degrees, and that's in the dead of winter, if there even is such a thing on the equator, right? He's just never known anything other than 70-degree weather and above. That's his whole life's experience. Also, he has no TV, he has no Twitter, he has no television, he's got nothing like that. Well, let's say that one day, onto the shores of his little island comes a ship from Norway. The Norwegians have discovered his little island, and they, come up to the sands of his island, and they get off, and they get to talking to each other. And let's say that the Norwegians say to our guy on the island, there is this thing that happens where this water right here that we're paddling around in, where this water can actually turn into a stone. And the guy on the island is just like, no way! There is absolutely no way. And the Norwegians say, yes, of course there's a way this water can turn into stone. If it gets cold enough outside, it will turn into ice. And the guy is going to say, no, I am declaring right now that it is impossible for water to turn into a stone. Ice does not exist. Now, why is he saying that? He's saying that because ice and the conditions for ice are utterly outside the realm of his experience. It's not because ice is somehow impossible. It's just that he's never seen it. And he doesn't even have the sort of mental categories and the mental structure to be able to conceive of ice. But it doesn't mean ice doesn't exist. And when the Norwegians leave, they're going to say, look, dude, you can stick in that skepticism all you want, but I hope you get a bowl of ice cream someday. It's really good stuff. All that to say is that just be careful before you declare that miracles are absolutely impossible. You may be telling the world more about yourself than you are about miracles. So that's the first thing. Okay, so back to this. If you've got this sort of explosion that happens on that particular Sunday morning, right, and then everything happens in history, there's this massive thing that happens, and the question is, what is this? What is this thing? Christians say it's the resurrection. Skeptical scholars don't want to give credence to the idea that the resurrection caused all that, and so they've done the work over the last 2,000 years of trying to say that maybe there are other explanations out there of what actually happened. So one of those, and the question is, for Christians, okay, do any of them work as an explanation? Do any of them actually work in explaining what happened? And Christian scholars have gone back and said, no, all of the explanations that you're given don't actually get it for whatever set of reasons. So let me give you a smattering of some of those. Actually, this is more than a smattering. These are like the leading candidates, the best ones. What if the women on that Sunday morning and then the apostles went to the wrong tomb? What if they walked into the wrong garden, they walked to the wrong tomb, and they walked into a tomb that actually wasn't used at all, and it's empty, and they become convinced that Jesus is alive, right? Maybe, and they start telling everybody, and bam, everything happens in Christian history, right? What if that's the case? Does that seem plausible to you as a historical explanation? I don't think so, and the reason that I don't think so is because the Jewish leaders and the Romans had every motivation to correct that error if that error had actually been made. I mean, you can read the historically plausible accounts now that we've determined they're historically reliable and plausible. You can read those historically plausible accounts and see that the Jews were really worried about it. They were actually really, really worried about determining and nailing down where Jesus' body is with the express purpose of being able to produce the body if anybody decided to make good on those promises Jesus made that he had been resurrected from the dead. They were really worried that the disciples were going to go steal the body, right? And so if the disciples had done this, if they'd gone to the wrong tomb and walked out into the city of Jerusalem and started saying, the guy's resurrected from the dead, the Pharisees and Pilate himself would have been like, no. You went to the wrong tomb, and so we've got this seal on the tomb here, and the soldiers are guarding it, and you know what? Go get the body of Jesus hanging on the city wall, and let's just put an end to this. Nobody ever did that. Why not? Because it's not historically plausible that they went to the wrong tomb. There were too many things that were defending against that error for it to be the thing that explains the explosion. They didn't go to the wrong tomb. Okay, well, let's do this one. What if Jesus didn't die on the cross, he just nearly died? Anybody ever seen Princess Bride? There's a big difference between dead and nearly dead, Billy Crystal. This is actually a common thing. This is an ancient objection to Christianity. It's one that Islam actually makes against Christianity, is that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't actually die. He was just really close to dead. In fact, he was so close to dead that his heart had stopped, all his vitals, his skin had gone ashen, and he looked dead. And so what happened is that they took his almost dead body, put it in the tomb, and 3 days, on the third day, 2.5 days later, this Jesus sort of stumbles to life, right? And he comes out, appears to his disciples, and they declare not that he's just been resuscitated, but that he's resurrected from the dead. What about that? And then bam, boom, Jesus resurrected. That's what happened. Historically plausible? I don't think so. I just don't think so. I mean, you'd have to have, you remember the hoax thing. I mean, you'd almost have to have the hoax thing running, and that's unlikely, we've already seen, for this to even be barely plausible. But I don't even think it passes the smell test. I mean, it's just ridiculous to think that Jesus, let's even say that somehow this guy, he's been in the tomb with no food and no water for 2 days, like a little more than 48 hours. He's got nail wounds through his wrists, nail wounds through his ankles. He's got a spear wound in his side, no food and water. He's been flogged, so there's no skin on his back because of the flogging. And let's say that somehow this dude manages to move this multi-ton rock off the wall. Somehow he manages to do that, right? No angelic help. You can't have the angels help if this is the explanation. So he gets that out of the way. Who knows how that happens? He stumbles into the apartment where the apostles are staying, and he says, "I am the Lord of life and the conqueror of death." They're not going to believe. They're going to go get a doctor. They're not going to run out talking about how this guy's resurrected and is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. They're going to be glad their friend is alive, and they're going to go try to save his life. That's what they're going to do. It's just utterly implausible that Jesus was nearly dead instead of all dead. It just absolutely doesn't make any sense. Let's see. Let me look and see what some others of these are. Wrong tomb, almost died. Yeah, it's very similar to the wrong tomb one, but there's they did in fact steal the body, right? Which essentially is the hoax idea, right? They're pulling off a hoax on the world, and all the objections that we lodged earlier to the idea of a hoax come into play. And it just becomes utterly implausible. It's sort of a connection or a combination of everything that's wrong with this and everything that's wrong with the hoax idea, right? The whole point of putting the seal on the tomb and placing the soldiers there and all the rest was to prevent this. They were worried about that, right? And so we're going to say that somehow the disciples pulled it off over the might of the Roman Empire, and then they pulled off it's got everything wrong. It's like wrong multiplied by wrong. There's just no way that the stealing the body thing worked, and then they pulled off a hoax, and bam, that's what caused it all. They get way less plausible after that. There's mass hallucination. They were overwhelmed by a dream or a mystical experience, a profound heavenly feeling of forgiveness and new spiritual life. Victims of a severe case of wishful thinking. We've already talked about that. Yeah. Look, when you come right down to it, here's the thing. We could line up. There's maybe, I don't know, I just listed off about the top 7 of them. There's maybe 7 alternative explanations for this whole thing that scholars have offered over the last 2,000 years. And the point is that not a single one of them is historically plausible. There's only one explanation for everything that happened right here, and that is that Jesus actually bodily, truly got up from the dead, and the disciples' lives were changed by it. So at the end of the day, I think what we can say is that the Bible's historically reliable, all right? That's everything from here over, right? The translations are good, the transmission is good, it's the right books, and the dudes who wrote it seem to be trustworthy guys. They want us to believe what they believe, and they truly believe it. And then you start looking at actually what they're talking about, and there's no other explanation that even gets close to plausible other than what they said happened actually happened. Jesus got up from the dead. So, just to close the circle, if that's true, Then we've got a case for the resurrection of Jesus that is not circular, right? Do you notice what I didn't do in this case? This is important. I did not make the case that Jesus was resurrected from the dead based on a presupposition that the Bible is the Word of God. I didn't do that. I did not say, Bible's the Word of God, therefore Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and if you believe otherwise, you're not. I didn't do that. Didn't do any pulpit pounding like that. This case for the resurrection of Jesus was based on the principles of doing history, right? That's how it's done. And what we came to was a historically reliable conclusion that Jesus got up from the dead. And there are, therefore, massive implications of that. I mean, the most massive implication isn't even that the Bible is the Word of God. I mean, that's the question that you all wanted me to answer in coming here. Why do we believe the Bible? Well, this is why. But the most massive implication of Jesus getting up from the dead is that he is not just the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is your King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's the most massive implication. And the question is whether you're going to recognize that now of your own free will, or whether you're going to recognize it later when either you die and stand before him, or he comes back and you stand before him, and you don't have any choice but to recognize it. That's the greatest implication. So, I'm sure you've got, if you came in and you're not a Christian or you've never thought about these things, I'm sure you've got other questions. We're going to take, the next however long to work through some of those as you put them on Sligo or whatever that's called. But if you've got questions, my exhortation and plea to you really would be, don't just put those questions on the shelf. The most important thing you can figure out in this life is whether you think Jesus actually got up from the dead. If he did, it changes everything. If he didn't, it also changes everything. So don't put these questions on the shelf as if your job or your studies or your this or that is more important than this question. This is the most important thing you can do. And if you're struggling with it, go after those questions. Find them. Christians have been thinking about these things for a long, long time, and there are, in fact, answers to your questions. All right. Thanks, guys, for your time.
All right, we're going to go straight into that Q&A time. And if you have the app open, you'll see some of those questions, and you can be thumbing up ones that you especially want to hear Greg answer. I'm just going to set us up real quickly here, and then we'll do that. So several questions came in that are about the book of Hebrews.
Yeah.
So apostolicity, if we aren't sure who the author of Hebrews is, how are we sure that's part of the Bible?
Are there other ones too, or just that one? Oh, it's just the same thing. Yeah, the disciples, or not the disciples, the early Christians just decided very early on that they were sure enough that it came from the hand of one of the apostles. Even though they weren't exactly sure. They thought for a long time that it was Paul, decided eventually that it was not Paul, but they decided that there's enough eyewitness apostolic authority, not authority, but like texture, apostolic texture to it, that they accepted it as apostolic. The interesting thing about Hebrews, though, is that because of that, it was actually one of the last books to sort of slide under the line. So even in thinking about the process of the canon being created and defended, you can see the early Christians being extremely careful and non-gullible. So Hebrews was really the one that they had a hard time with, and it took a long time. But finally, the conclusion was, we think this thing is apostolic. We still have some question about it, but it meets all the other criteria with flying colors. And even though there's some lacuna, there's some blank in our knowledge about it, we're going to accept it anyway. The thing that's important for us in thinking about this is how careful they were with it, though. The book of James had the same problem, only on another criteria. It was one of the Hebrews and James were like the last two to make it in, right? But with James, it wasn't apostolicity that held it up for a long time. It was. Anybody want to take a guess? What do you think it was? Orthodoxy, yeah. They had a hard time figuring out if James was saying something different than Paul. And finally, they came to the conclusion in chapter 2. And finally, they came to the conclusion that, no, James is saying exactly the same thing as Paul. He's just using language and words in a different way, and so it too slid under the wire along with Hebrews. But I think what's fascinating there is that they're not gullible. I think people often think that because these people lived 2,000 years ago that they were stupid and gullible. And so we'll do that all the time with the Bible. We'll be reading along with the Bible and run across something that doesn't quite make sense to us, and we'll just chalk it up to the gullibility and stupidity of these ancient authors. Well, actually, the more you look into it, you start to realize that, they're not the stupid, gullible ones. We kind of are, right? And you'll find that their writings are making a lot more sense than you're making of them. And that's what's going on. You see them being super, super careful with which books they're going to allow to be accepted into the canon, and Hebrews and James are two great examples of it.
Related to that, what about the Old Testament? So you have extra books in, say, the Catholic Bible. You
Yeah.
have the Apocrypha. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, the Apocrypha, as it exists today, with Roman Catholics sort of believing that they're a part of the Bible, was a complete 100% historical accident. The Jews, the ancient Jews, never, ever accepted the books of the Apocrypha as they called them the books that defile the hands. That's what they called them. It was just a way of talking about the honor with which we're supposed to hold these 39 Old Testament books, the books that defile the hands. The Apocrypha were never, ever, ever books that defile the hands, and everybody knew it, right? So when they didn't have books, the ancient Jews didn't. They had boxes of scrolls, and so there were certain boxes that contained books which defile the hands, and there was another box that contained books that were just edifying, fun to read, good, important. We like these books, but they don't defile the hands in the same way. Well, what happened over time, and it's a purely historical accident, is that once you start to get codices, which this is a codex, and any book that this is a codex. This is a codex. Anything that looks, has this kind of form is called a codex, and the plural of that is codices, not codexes. Anyway, once you start to get these, what happened is that the 39 books that defile the hands were printed and put into the codex, and then right after that, instead of being in a different box, it would just be a different section of the codex. The books which do not defile the hands but are still helpful were put into the codex right after them. And over time, what happened is that the distinction between the two just got lost. And so over a few hundred years, eventually you get a tradition that builds up throughout the Catholic Church that all of these books are books which defile the hands. And then at some point, the Pope, I forget which one it was, just recognized that and used his ex cathedra power and said they're all the Bible. So total 100% historical accident. The Jews were very clear. They had the Tanakh, you remember that? The law, the prophets, and the writings, the Tanakh, T-N-K.
You talk about the King James Version. And someone asks, why is it still used today when its translation is not as accurate?
I think tradition. I mean, it's tradition and beauty is what I would say. There are things that the King James does in certain sections of the Bible, the Psalms in particular, that are just breathtakingly beautiful. And it's that high, poetic, old English that makes it so. And people love that, and I love that. Another reason is tradition, right? You've all memorized certain parts of the King James probably without even knowing it. I bet if we all gave our memorization of John 3:16, it would, for most of us, it would be the King James Version. And so it just sort of sticks. The King James is not a bad translation. It makes some mistakes because it accepts a certain manuscript tradition that we actually know is not the best manuscript tradition. And so it'll throw in things every once in a while that probably don't belong. But it's not a bad translation, and if you love it, I would say continue to use it. If you're going to preach a sermon, you probably want to look at the NASB, the ESV, and the NIV alongside it, just to be sure.
Putting you on the spot here, when the King James was written, how many roughly manuscripts did we have? You said over 5,000 today. A few dozen is?
Yeah, I don't know.
Somewhere
I'm not sure.
far fewer. So I think that just underscores some of what you were teaching in that earlier session today. Like how many people here grew up mainly using the King James Version of the Bible? All right. Now, of those people, how many of you mainly use that today? All right. Not one of you. One of you. And of you who had the hand up and then the hand down, how many of you would say changing translation of the Bible from a translation that started with far fewer manuscripts, your beliefs just significantly changed. Like that was a real turning point for you in your faith, and you kind of changed and clarified so many beliefs because you changed a couple maybe. Yeah, I think that underscores what you were talking about earlier. With all the differences, there aren't major doctrinal changes, even with all this new manuscript evidence of the last few hundred years.
Yeah. The thing that's problematic, there's no problem using the King James. I mean, it's great, right? The problem is when you run into folks who will say that it is the King James version itself that is the inspired Word of God. You don't want to say that. That's just absolute foolishness. The King James version of the Bible is not inspired. Nobody would even say that of the ESV. Nobody would say that of the NIV. No, what's inspired are the original autographs, right? The autograph means self-written, like the self-written things of the apostles. So the original autographs are what is inspired, not the translations and the copies and all the stuff that comes after, including the King James version. So you just don't want to say that. I had a guy in my church who said one time when my church was, this is when I was a kid, was switching to, I think, the NIV, and the dude made the argument that if the King James is good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me too. Yeah. Don't make that argument.
So from that, people say, okay, the originals are inspired. Is my English Bible, when I hold it, is this the inspired Word of God?
Yeah. Yeah, insofar as it reflects what was originally written. Yeah.
And you're saying
it does.
It does.
Yeah.
A specific question here. What explanation is offered for the verses in Mark 16 that are not in all manuscripts? We could say the same for John 8. Those are kind of the two passages.
Yeah, I just preached on John 8 not so long ago. And what I said about that would be almost perfectly applicable to the longer ending of Mark. And it's essentially that, I wish I had time to pull it up. I could tell you. If that's your question and you want to talk about that more, come ask me and I can search my email and find that sermon manuscript and I could even email it to you. But it's essentially that John 8 and Mark 16 don't show up in the manuscript tradition until 400 years later. Also, at least as it pertains to John 8, the story of John 8, this beautiful story of the woman caught in adultery and Jesus saying, writing in the dirt and go and sin no more, it shows up in the manuscript tradition, not always right there in John 8, but at various places in the book of John. It'll show up at the end in one, it'll show up here, it'll show up there, it'll show up John 8, it shows up all over the place, which kind of says, okay, this was a story that might actually have been true, right? It may be part of the oral tradition, people had heard this story. It might actually have happened, in fact. But what we certainly know about it is that Christians loved it. They just think it reflects Jesus. They think it sounds just like him. They love that story. And they wanted it somewhere. They just couldn't figure out where to put it because John didn't put it in his book. So therefore, it's not scripture, but it's kind of like the Apocrypha, right? It's a beloved story that probably reflects a whole lot of truth, may even be the truth, but John didn't write it, and they couldn't figure out where to stick it. So, I don't know if that's true of the ending of Mark, but it's those kinds of considerations, just like for John 8, that are going to cast a lot of doubt on the ending of Mark. So, if you want to know about John 8 in particular, just if that's your question, come up and ask me. I can give you all the detailed info about it.
Here's a question about our conversations with others. What's a good way to turn a bad faith argument about textual criticism to someone's heart, to the root of unbelief?
Okay, so we're assuming it's a bad faith question. It's not that all questions about text criticism are bad faith, right? There are good questions about all this stuff, and you shouldn't assume that any question that, is back in this stuff is a bad one. That's the first thing I would say. You should try to answer them, and if you can't answer it, find the answer. But once you've gotten there, somebody seems to be digging their heels in. They're not accepting, any sort of good answer. Let's just say it's a bad faith. But what I would do in evangelism all the time, and my church sits right next to the University of Louisville, so I'll get freshman philosophy majors who will come up and want to talk about Christian philosophy, or I'll get people who have problems with the flood, or I'll get people who have problems with Christian sexual ethics, or the creation, or whatever. There's this whole cloud of stuff out there that people have problems with Christianity about. my general approach to that is to say some thoughtful things about whatever question they've got, right? Try to pin them to the wall a little bit on their whatever it is they're asking about. Just prove to them that, they're not going to be able to steamroll me with their... I mean, it's incredible to me that a freshman philosopher will come up to me anyway and assume that his little question is the one that's going to take down Christianity. I'm just like, you are such a punk. So I'll answer the question, but eventually and fairly quickly, I'm going to try to get out of the cloud of stuff, get out of the cloud and press on them and just say, look, we can spend the rest of our lives talking about creation, sexual ethics, this, and this, all these objections that you've got, and waste our time. Or if you really want to get to the core of what Christianity is, we can go to the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead or not? Because it's like the linchpin that holds the whole thing together. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, if you pull that out, the whole thing collapses. If you can prove to me, freshman philosophy major, that Jesus did not in fact rise from the dead, if you can make that seem implausible to me, I'll quit my job tomorrow and I'll stop being a Christian. But on the other hand, if we get to the end of talking about this and me laying out evidence and you reading books and all the rest, and you come to the conclusion that, yeah, it's actually historically plausible that he did rise from the dead, that's got massive implications for you. So let's not waste time bickering about the cloud of stuff that you might have objections about. Let's go right to the heart of it and put our money where our mouth is and decide together, did Jesus rise from the dead or not? I think that's what you do.
Let's take that a step further. So someone does some examining. They say, this makes a lot of sense. I think he probably rose from the dead. Where do you go from there? Because what you're describing as faith is more than that.
Yeah. Well, there's a huge difference. You've all heard there's a couple of things to say about that. One is you're not going to argue anybody into regeneration. You can't argue anybody into the kingdom. That's a miracle that has to happen in the heart. It's done by the Spirit of God. What apologetics like this is good for, though, and what the Holy Spirit will often use it for, is that he will use his people and their apologetic making a case, as Peter says, to remove obstacles out of the way, right? He'll allow his people to do that, and then once the obstacles are removed, then he does the work of regeneration. He'll do that often. Now, there are often other times, and you've probably seen him, where he doesn't wait for the obstacles to be removed at all, and he just plows right through them, and regenerates somebody, right? That happens too. But the Holy Spirit just seems to use us to do this work of getting obstacles out of the way, and then he regenerates. So that's what apologetics is doing, is taking away obstacles. So at the end of it, once all the obstacles are removed, you still need that miracle, right? You still need that to happen. That's what's going to tip somebody over into faith in Jesus. But there's also a huge difference between believing that something happened and believing in something. Does that make sense? You can believe that Jesus existed and yet not be trusting in Jesus. And so that is actually what... And those two things are... English confuses it because those two meanings of belief are utterly different, right? One is just like intellectual assent, and the other one is faith, trust, reliance. And the two are not the same thing. Now, this one requires this one. You have to give intellectual assent to something before you can lean on it, right? But this does not require this, and we ought to have different English words for it. But belief tends to cover it all. So, do the apologetic work, pray that the Lord will do that miracle, but what you want to then press on is, look, I don't just want you to sort of admit grudgingly that Jesus rose from the dead historically. What I want you to do is see the implications of that and then rely on this resurrected Jesus to save you from your sin. Because once you say he's resurrected, then everything falls into place, right? Then you need to believe him when he says that you're a sinner. You need to believe him when he says that you're liable to hell because of that sin. You need to believe him when he says, I'm the only one who can save you from this. You need to believe him when, the whole thing, it all just falls into place. So you're pressing for this kind of faith, not just this kind of assent.
What would you say to someone who's reading Scripture and they come, maybe they're even a Christian who believes all of this, but they still just kind of get tripped up when you read about the walls of Jericho falling down or the virgin birth or something like that? It's like, I want to believe this, but it's just hard. Do you work through all of this in your own life when you come to places like that, or do you not have that response to passages?
Well, no, I think I have at various times, but I just think Okay, literally the craziest thing that I could possibly believe as a modern human being is that Jesus got up from the dead. That's literally the craziest thing that I could possibly believe. Like, that's the thing that will get me ostracized in the world. That's the thing that the world is just absolutely not going to accept. And if I've accepted that, why is the virgin birth so hard? Right? I mean, it's just not. I mean, if God has the power to raise people from the dead, raise his son from the dead, why would I have a problem with a virgin birth or some rocks falling off of one another at the walls of Jericho, or God, making water stand up so that none of that is as hard as the resurrection. And then you've got this whole case that we've made here that the guy who got resurrected didn't have a problem with any of that stuff. So who am I to say that I didn't resurrect, right? So I'm not going to get in an argument with the guy. So if he believes it, why wouldn't I? So yeah, I don't know. I don't feel the need to prove every little thing in the Bible because I've got the resurrection of Jesus standing there as a kind of anchor for the whole thing all at once. So, I don't need to come to this kind of, gritty case about the walls of Jericho. I've got this. It's the tent peg. It holds the whole thing up. It establishes everything. And personally, I'm good to go. I bet you could make an argument for the walls of Jericho that's similar to this. I just don't feel the need to because I've got the resurrection.
Someone asked an interesting question here. Are we accountable for wrong doctrine if it's obtained through mistakes in transmission and translation?
I'm not sure how to answer that because I don't think I think that's an empty category. I don't think there is any wrong doctrine that exists because of mistakes in translation and transmission.
So you mentioned that. Maybe just talk a little bit more about that. The types of differences in those manuscripts.
Yeah, they don't. You look at all 5,400 of those manuscripts, and there's a bunch of differences, right? There's like 500. If you take the whole 5,400 manuscripts, right, and lay them all out, they're literally like 500,000 little differences in them. They're everywhere. But the thing is, they're not big ones. It's going to be the difference between, like I said, most of them are nonsensical, right? It's just stuff like misspellings of a word. It's a clear misspelling. Sometimes it's a word missing. It's just very clear. They're nonsensicals. You can throw all those out, and then you're only dealing with like 200,000 differences over the whole 5,400 manuscripts, right? After that, then you've got things that are the difference between plurals and singulars, right? So did Jesus sit on one donkey or two donkeys, and all of that kind of jazz. You've got the difference between the past and the present tense in the Greek, which ends up making no difference at all in most cases. My point is that once you get rid of all of that kind of stuff, you end up with a big goose egg on places in the New Testament where we're not sure exactly what the original said, and yet it has some massive or even significant implication for Christian doctrine. There are just zero of those. So, are there ones that are a little bit more important? Yeah, we kind of need to know where Jesus went when he went across. There are things that are important. I'm not saying that, but nothing that's sitting on any kind of, big Christian doctrine.
Possibly, the person's thinking about the New World Translation.
Good question. Sure. If you're Jehovah's Witness and you have swallowed the New World Translation, Jesus was a God as opposed to God, you're culpable for that because there are resources out there, and there is in fact an entire Christian history screaming at you that is wrong, and you are culpable for that. There's not a Jehovah's Witness in the world who hasn't heard somebody say to them, that's wrong, right? There's nobody. Maybe there's somebody. There's basically nobody, though, that hasn't been warned about that and therefore has a responsibility to check it out.
Interestingly, the New World Translation, you can't find who has translated it also. They don't have, you have dozens of scholars, but behind all these different translations that we're holding in our hands that are on record, and we know who they are, we can go talk to them and ask them questions. You don't have any of that with the New World Translation. A couple more questions. How can we respond to someone who says everything in the Bible after Jesus' death is just church talk and doesn't matter?
Church talk.
So we like Jesus, but the church,
Well-
we can't trust everything the church says.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little. You need to understand the place of the church in God's plan of salvation. It wasn't invented by a bunch of pastors who need jobs. It was invented by Jesus in Matthew 16. On this rock I will build my church. It's the very first thing that he does. He establishes his church as soon as he's got a believer in Peter. So I think you've just got to understand. Yeah, I mean, I think we think of church as like it's one little, it's like the green beans on the buffet of things we can eat for our own spiritual growth, right? And if I like green beans and find green beans helpful, I will eat the green beans. If I don't, however, I'll just do podcasts and I'll do, coffee meetings with, Bible studies and blah, blah, blah. But basically it's up to me what I do. And church is just like a fellowship meeting that could be helpful to you or not. It's optional in the Christian life because we're all about following Jesus. I would just say if that's how you think about church, you've misunderstood it entirely. You don't know what the church is. If Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and if he is the Lord of a kingdom that has reinvaded the world, the church is the embassy of the high King of heaven in the fallen world. That's what it is. It acts and speaks with his authority, and there's nothing else in all the world that does that. So, if you don't love the church and honor the church, you don't love and honor Jesus. You are correcting Jesus, basically, and telling him that the first thing he should have done is not establish the church, but establish a Bible study at Starbucks. And I think you would find yourself in a pretty good argument with him about that.
Speaking of church, Greg's going to be with us tomorrow morning. 9 a.m., we're going to be back in this room speaking. He's going to be speaking on the matter of assurance. You want to give a just brief plug for what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I've just published a book in the last month or so called Assured, that is a sort of examination of Christian assurance. What does it mean to be assured of our salvation, and what are some of the things that often will shake our assurance and even undermine it? So we're going to be talking about that, the architecture of Christian assurance. What are the questions you ought to be asking? Where should you be putting weight and focus if you want more assurance? If you struggle with assurance, we're going to try to do some diagnosis of what might be causing that, right? Because there's a lot of things that could be causing it. So we'll be thinking about lots of those questions.
And then one more question that points forward to Greg's sermon tomorrow. So how does the resurrection empower a new way of life today? For the answer to that, he's going to be preaching tomorrow from Romans chapter 8, verses 9 to 11, and is going to be talking about that very thing. So looking forward to that. For those of you who do have some quick follow-up questions with Greg, you want to catch him for just a few minutes after this, you can do that. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you giving up so much time on a weekend. Greg, thank you for making the trip up here.
Thank you.
All right. You are dismissed.
Greg, when you going to write a book on time management?
I don't.